Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something so wildly unexpected, it might just make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval life. Not knights and castles, not dragons. Nope. Tonight, we're talking horoscopes. But not just any horoscopes. We're going full medieval, full fertility calendar, full Mars is in retrograde, so you probably shouldn't get pregnant on a Thursday, unless you want a demon baby. I know, this is not the bedtime story you were expecting. But trust me, you're going to want to hear how deeply these old-school astrologers got into everyone's love life, conception schedules, and baby-making rituals. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this, if you're into logic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and what time you're watching this. I love seeing where you all tune in from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, so picture it. You're in 14th century England. The streets smell like regret and turnip soup. The skies are grey, the plague's a casual background detail, and you and your partner are trying to have a baby. But this isn't just about love and biology. No. This is cosmic warfare. Before even considering intimacy, you'd better consult your friendly neighbourhood astrologer. Or, if you're lower class, maybe your local midwife who dabbles in forbidden stargazing. Why? Because back then, people genuinely believed that the success of conception and the quality of the baby depended entirely on the alignment of planets and stars at that very moment. Like, if Venus was out of whack, bad time, Mars in your 7th house, too much aggression, Saturn in your partner's 5th, might as well try again next lifetime, and I'm not even exaggerating. These horoscopes weren't playful little blurbs in the back of a magazine. They were full-on astronomical breakdowns of planetary positions, complete with tables, moon cycles, and lists of herbs you were supposed to gather under starlight for enhanced outcomes. And no, most of them didn't work, but they tried. Oh, did they try? This whole thing wasn't just backyard mysticism either. It was medical practice, like the university-trained doctors. Yes, the ones wearing robes and muttering in Latin. They had entire textbooks instructing them on how to map a woman's fertility across the 12 signs of the Zodiac. Aries might be hot and dry, good for conception of a bold child. Pisces, too watery, emotional, prone to melancholy. The entire womb was basically a zodiac calendar in their minds, ruled not by biology, but by celestial permission slips. But here's where it gets deliciously weird. It wasn't just the woman who needed the stars to be right. Men had astrological fertility profiles too. You'd need to be born under the right rising sign to have, let's say, vigorous essence. Yes, we're talking medieval sperm astrology. There were entire doctrines dedicated to explaining how a man's birth sign, his current transits, and even his mood, if not governed by proper planetary vibes, could doom a child to be weak, or worse, cursed. One popular belief was that your seed had different qualities depending on which planet was influencing you at the time of conception. Mars meant a warrior child, strong but maybe too aggressive. Mercury, clever, sure, but possibly deceitful. Saturn, cold, melancholic, and probably going to write poetry in the attic. And if the moon was void, of course, during the act, pack it up. The kid was either not going to happen or end up deeply confused about everything, including why their parents thought this was a good idea. Now, you're probably wondering, was this just a peasant superstition? Oh no, this was top-down endorsed. Monarchs planned royal births using astrological charts. Heirs to thrones were conceived not in romantic spontaneity, but during carefully calculated windows when Venus, Jupiter, and the moon all said, "Yup, go for it." If that window happened to be during Lent or someone had the flu, tough luck, the stars don't reschedule. And there was this fascinating thing where couples would pay astrologers to elect the best time for conception. This meant creating an electional chart, a horoscope specifically timed to maximise conception success and child quality. Think wedding planner meets star whisperer. Your astrologer would flip through planetary ephemerides, grunt a little, maybe pause dramatically, and then announce that Thursday at twilight was your golden hour, not a moment before, and if you were serious about it, you'd pair this moment with planetary herbs and specific prayers, because why not throw everything at the problem? There's even a documented case where a noblewoman refused to sleep with her husband because Mercury was in the wrong house, and she didn't want a child who'd grow up to be a liar. The husband, reasonably confused but unable to argue with astrology, waited. I mean, what could he say? But honey, I want a dishonest child. No one wants to raise a medieval con man. Of course, today we know a lot of this is nonsense, right? The idea that Mars makes you more fertile or that Venus blesses your womb is, at best, poetic. But here's the thing. They were trying. In a time when people didn't understand ovulation, genetics, or how anything microscopic worked, astrology filled in the blanks. It gave them patterns to follow, order in the chaos, and, just maybe, some comfort that the universe was watching and had a plan. Even if that plan sometimes included telling people not to conceive during an eclipse or they'd give birth to a child with goat hooves. Fun historical fact for tonight. The oldest surviving English medical text that links astrology to conception is from the 12th century and includes a zodiac wheel with detailed commentary on which signs to avoid if you want to prevent defects of the limbs. What kind of defects? It doesn't say, just limbs. Good luck with that. And a fringe gem to tuck you in. One obscure German manuscript insists that children conceived during certain hours of the day, aligned to the planet Mercury, would grow up to become thieves or tax collectors. Same category. Both apparently bad. And as for scholarly debate, well, some historians argue that medieval astrology wasn't taken that seriously by most people, especially commoners. Others say it was deeply integrated into everyday life, especially among the educated classes and midwives. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but either way, horoscopes were way more than entertainment. They were life plans. Anyway, tuck that under your pillow and let it haunt your next stargazing moment. You're standing in a candlelit room that smells faintly of beeswax, dried herbs, and something metallic you can't quite name. A woman lies on a straw-filled bed, clutching her belly, her midwife whispering something over a brass astrolabe while glancing at the smoky window where the moon is rising. She isn't praying to God. Not really. She's calculating which sign the moon currently occupies. Because tonight the stars will decide if this child is going to thrive, or even make it out of the womb. This is how seriously the Zodiac was taken when it came to women's reproductive cycles in the Middle Ages. The belief wasn't just that the stars could influence conception, it was that each individual part of the reproductive process, from menstruation to implantation to birth itself, was mapped to the heavens like a divine biology textbook. Your uterus in this medieval model wasn't just an organ, it was a cosmic chamber, ruled by lunar rhythms, astrological tides, and planetary visitors who had the power to bless or curse whatever came into being there. The 12 signs of the zodiac weren't just vague personality profiles either. Each one had medical properties. Aries, for example, was hot and dry, good for conception, they said, but risky if your body already ran warm. Cancer was cold and moist, and supposedly increased the likelihood of conception, but also raised the chances of excessive emotionality in the fetus, whatever that meant to a 14th century physician. Every sign was also associated with a part of the body, in a map called the Zodiac Man, who was basically a star-shaped anatomy chart. The reproductive organs, those fell under Scorpio, which should tell you a lot. Scorpio, ruled by Mars and often tied to secrecy and vice, was both feared and revered. Conceiving while the moon passed through Scorpio was said to result in powerful children, yes, but also potentially violent, unbalanced, or even born with physical abnormalities. One 13th century text advised avoiding Scorpio altogether if you desired a child of calm temper and straight limb. That's how specific it got. Want a healthy, happy baby? Wait until the moon is in Taurus or Libra. Want a baby who grows up to duel people in taverns over spilled ale? Go ahead, try it under Scorpio. The zodiac was also used to track menstruation cycles, though they didn't call it that. They had euphemisms, the red tide, the cleansing, or just the time of the moon, but astrologers believed that each menstrual cycle began under a different astrological influence. The more favourable the alignment at the start of a woman's moon time, the more fertile the cycle would be. There were even charts that matched ovulation windows to moon phases and zodiac signs. Waning moons were bad news. Waxing moons? Hopeful. Full moons were double-edged swords, lots of energy, yes, but also unpredictable. And if you dared to ignore the signs and conceive under an eclipsed moon, Let's just say they kept a black goat on standby, just in case a sacrifice was needed to ward off evil spirits, and the precision didn't stop there. Time of day mattered too. Conception at night under a fire sign like Leo could make a child bold and restless. Daytime under an earth sign like Virgo would supposedly result in a practical, well-tempered baby. Again, there was no science, just a deep, unshakable belief in the influence of celestial bodies on earthly life, especially the creation of new life. This belief was passed along not just in formal medical texts, but in herbals, prayers, and whispered advice between generations of women. It was the grandmother's guidance, the midwife's quiet warning, the scribbled note tucked into the pages of a family grimoire. And don't assume this was strictly a female concern. Men were also involved, sometimes obsessively. Husbands tracked their wives' cycles on astrological calendars, noting the moon's position with more care than they gave their land deeds. There's even evidence that some men would abstain from sex entirely during certain moon phases or zodiac signs, believing that bad timing could affect not only fertility, but the spiritual essence of the resulting child. Because if the stars said your kid would turn out wicked, it didn't matter how loving you were as a parent, the stars didn't care. Fate was fate. A real historical fact for you. The lunarium was a kind of medieval almanac that tracked lunar phases for exactly this reason. It helped people plan everything from farming to, yes, their sex lives. Monasteries kept them. So did midwives. Even royals consulted lunaria before arranging trysts meant to produce heirs. The idea that you could manipulate destiny through timing wasn't seen as superstition, it was seen as wisdom. Now for something a little more fringe. In one especially weird treatise found in 15th century France, a physician claimed that women born under the sign of Gemini were more likely to bear twins, but only if they conceived under a new moon while Jupiter was in the first house. The recipe was that specific. Like a medieval smoothie. 2 parts Gemini, 1 part Jupiter, a splash of new moon, and voila, double babies. Of course, not everyone agreed on the interpretations. That's where things get murky. Some schools of thought insisted that Sagittarius brought long-legged, optimistic children. Others said it led to reckless, impulsive offspring. One camp feared births under Capricorn as doomed to melancholy and chronic illness. Another claimed it was the ideal sign for politicians and clergy. Scholars argued in smoky universities over these details, sometimes getting genuinely heated. Because this wasn't just about astrology, it was about medicine, theology, and destiny. And this debate spilled into the church. Officially, the church condemned astrology when it threatened the notion of free will. If the stars decided everything, where was the room for sin or redemption? But privately, many monks and clerics practiced astrology in secret, especially the medical kind. The celestial body was too tempting. It offered order in chaos, hope in hardship. And in a world where women died regularly in childbirth and infants often didn't survive their first year, any promise of control, even from the stars, was worth holding on to. So tonight, as you drift off under your LED stars or maybe the real thing outside your window, think about what it meant to live in a world where everything about your body, its cycles, its pains, its possibilities, was seen as a message from above. Every missed period a sign, every cramp a celestial whisper, every child a star-written sentence that began before the first heartbeat. And you would have been watching the skies, counting moons, and praying that Venus was smiling just enough to make everything okay. So, let's say it's a lazy spring evening and you're lying in bed with your partner in your drafty candlelit medieval cottage. The chickens outside have finally shut up. Your neighbour hasn't died of something unspeakable in at least 2 days. The mood is perfect. Or, is it? You both pause. Someone remembers to check the stars, because no matter how steamy things get, the ultimate third wheel in any medieval love affair was always the sky. And no 2 celestial bodies meddled more aggressively in your sex life than Venus and Mars. Venus was the patroness of beauty, femininity, fertility, and all things soft, perfumed, and inviting. Mars, on the other hand, was passion, aggression, virility, and let's just say, endurance. In theory, Venus was the loving caress, Mars the lustful thrust. When they were in harmony, perfect. When they clashed, you got anything from impotency to conception during wrath, a category of child associated with short tempers and unexpected violence. That wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was a diagnosis. In the medieval mind, planetary bodies didn't just influence your romantic fortune, they directly shaped your libido, your performance, your odds of conception, and even what kind of soul would be wrapped into the little being you might create that night. If Venus was ascendant and Mars favourably positioned, your union would be not only fertile, but blessed with mutual affection and pleasure. If Venus was in retrograde and Mars was combust, meaning scorched by proximity to the Sun, you might end up angry, unfulfilled, and worse, childless. Astrological manuals of the time were full of what we'd now call planetary sex guides. They had tables mapping the positions of Venus and Mars across all 12 signs, suggesting when to engage in intimacy, when to avoid it, and even what kind of behaviour might result. For example, Mars in Leo with Venus in Taurus, a night of powerful passion and potential conception. Mars in Cancer, Venus in Aquarius, a mismatch leading to sorrow of the loins. That's a direct quote from a 14th century almanac. Very dramatic, very specific. They even had ideal days and hours, tied to planetary rulership. Monday belonged to the Moon, Tuesday to Mars, Wednesday to Mercury, and so on. So if you wanted a sensual, emotionally rich experience, try Monday night, under the Moon's influence. If you were aiming for pure, fiery lust, and maybe a bold child, go for Tuesday, Mars's turf. But Friday, that was Venus's day. All things romantic, fruitful, and pleasurable found their home in the soft glow of Venus's favour. In fact, some couples would only attempt conception on Fridays, believing that a child born of Venus's love would be more beautiful, artistic, and loving. There was even astrological discourse on where intimacy should occur. Venus liked clean, sweet-smelling places, preferably with soft linens and maybe a bit of music. Mars didn't care. He liked fields, battlefields, back alleys, and barns. The setting, according to some writers, influenced the spiritual imprint left on the child at conception. So while it might be logistically easier to sneak off behind the stables, you were risking a child with earthy appetites and a lack of refinement. Yes, medieval people thought barn sex could make your baby rude. Now here's a juicy historical nugget. In the 13th century, the court astrologer to King Alfonso VI of Castile wrote an entire treatise on which Venus-Mars pairings produced noble versus common children. He theorised that when Venus was conjunct Mars in Libra, it created children with a noble bearing and fairness of face, while the same conjunction in Aries would produce children of great strength and valour, but of simple manners and crude appetites. So, essentially, Aries babies punch things and forget their pleases and thank yous. Classic. And it wasn't all about birth. The personality and fate of a marriage were also believed to hinge on the Venus-Mars dynamic in each spouse's natal chart. If one partner had Venus in Capricorn, cold, reserved, and practical, and the other had a Mars in Sagittarius, impulsive, adventurous, a total flirt, it was doomed. At best, they'd live separate emotional lives. At worst, one might run off with a travelling lute player. Not that you needed a chart to predict that, honestly. There were fringe beliefs too. In some corners of Europe, people thought that Mars and Venus were literal celestial lovers, their conjunctions creating cosmic energy that flooded the Earth with erotic power. Nights when the two planets visibly aligned were treated almost like mini-festivals, candles lit, offerings made, couples sneaking away into the woods under the pretext of picking herbs. Right. Interestingly, some astrologers warned against excessive Venus-Mars influence. They said it made people too driven by passion, obsessed with pleasure to the point of neglecting duty, faith, or self-control. One commentator wrote that children conceived under strong Venus-Mars conjunctions were more likely to become adulterers, actors, or poets. That was the whole list. 3 professions, apparently in the same moral category. And here's the scholarly debate of the hour. Was this all metaphor, or did people genuinely believe planetary positions could dictate personal and sexual outcomes? Some argue the charts were symbolic, useful for talking about temperament and compatibility. Others insist that the astrology of love and sex was taken as literal truth by both educated elites and the broader public. Based on how many medical and legal texts reference these planetary dynamics, it's safe to say this wasn't just poetic musing, it shaped lives, and probably a fair few awkward conversations in candlelit bedrooms. Imagine trying to explain to your partner that it's not you, it's Mars combust in the 8th house. So tonight, as you lie under your own sky, remember this. For centuries, love wasn't just written in the stars. It was read, calculated, and cautiously timed. Passion was a planet. Fertility was a function of cosmic math. And Mars and Venus weren't just distant lights. They were uninvited, all-powerful guests in every medieval bedroom. So now that you've been thoroughly warned about what Venus and Mars can do to your sex life, let's pivot slightly to something even more intimate, more peculiar, and somehow more celestial, medieval sperm astrology. Yes, that was a thing. You probably didn't think there'd be a whole astrological framework for a man's seed, but you'd be underestimating just how determined medieval thinkers were to tie every possible bodily fluid to the cosmos. And according to them, your odds of fathering a healthy, righteous child depended not only on whether you had Mars in your chart, but also on whether the moon was looking favourably at your, lower constellation. In medieval medical theory, built from a janky blend of Aristotle, Galen and mysticism, sperm was seen as the refined essence of a man's body, kind of like sweat but with higher stakes. The more perfect the essence, the more likely it would generate a virtuous, physically sound child. So naturally they believed its quality could wax and wane with the stars. If you were born under a strong Mars or Jupiter, astrologers claimed you had more vigorous, fertile seed. Born under Saturn? Oof. Cold. Dry. Lifeless. A man ruled by Saturn was considered less likely to conceive, and if he did, the resulting child might be melancholic, frail, or just generally unlucky. And unlucky children were a big deal in a world where half the kids didn't make it to age 5. But wait, it gets more specific. Some astrologers maintained that sperm had planetary properties that changed day to day. Depending on which planet ruled the hour, the seed would take on different traits. For example, if you, let's say, did the deed during an hour ruled by Jupiter, your seed was considered warm, generous, expansive, a future philosopher child, but during a Saturn hour, cold, sluggish, prone to producing children with a quiet demeanour and heavy eyelids. That's a real description. Heavy eyelids. You can't make this up. This belief also meant men had to be strategic. A truly responsible father, according to the astrological medical books of the time, would abstain during unfavourable planetary conditions, especially during eclipses. Medieval texts practically scream this in all caps: never conceive during an eclipse. It wasn't just bad luck, it was dangerous. There were treatises that claimed sperm exposed to eclipsed light produced cursed children. Some warned of blindness, others suggested the baby might come out mute or physically deformed. One French manuscript even insists that children conceived during eclipses cannot know joy. Ever. Just a lifetime of sighing and grey clothing. And then there's the real mindbender, sperm directionality. Certain astrological authors believed the Zodiac influenced not only fertility, but the aim and spread of the man's essence. Signs like Aries and Sagittarius were thought to create more forceful emissions, helping conception naturally. While Virgo and Pisces were seen as more delicate, and according to one particularly poetic writer, inclined to drift rather than strike. I'll let your imagination paint the rest. This wasn't fringe science either. In university medical curricula, astrology was woven directly into anatomy lessons. If a man came in complaining about infertility, the physician wouldn't just ask about his diet or stress level. He'd pull out a star chart. When was the last time you attempted conception? What were the moon's aspects to your natal Mercury? Was Mars in a cadent house? If so, sorry, you probably missed your chance. And if you were serious about fixing the issue, better start timing your attempts with Jupiter transits and the waxing moon. One widely circulated guide, The Secret Book of the Stars, recommended drinking warmed wine with ground saffron during Venus's hour to increase virility. It also suggested avoiding onions and beans under a waning moon, as they were thought to cloud the generative fire, which is, if nothing else, a poetic way to say you're going to be too gassy for intimacy. And yes, this extended to gender prediction too. Some astrologers claimed that sperm flavoured under Mars would yield a boy, while that influenced by Venus would produce a girl. If the moon was ascending in a masculine sign, Aries, Gemini, Leo, when you conceived, it tilted the odds toward a son. Feminine signs, Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, favoured daughters. These predictions were taken so seriously that disappointed fathers would sometimes blame the sky rather than themselves for not producing a male heir. The stars had their own paternity alibis. Now let's throw in a fringe fact you didn't ask for. A few extremely obscure texts suggest that sperm could be psychically influenced by the stars before it left the body, meaning the planets could beam down vibrations that pre-shaped the outcome of conception before anything even happened. Think prenatal horoscope, in the literal, pre-biological sense. Whether this was metaphor or full-on belief is up for debate, but the fact that someone even wrote it down should tell you a lot about where medieval heads were at. And that brings us to the scholarly question. Was all this star sperm theory just metaphorical, a kind of spiritual hygiene instruction? Or did they really think these cosmic influences physically altered reproductive material? The jury's out. Some modern historians suggest it was more symbolic, designed to encourage self-control, reverence and timing. Others argue that for the learned elite, astrology was as real as gravity. To them, the stars didn't just predict the quality of your child, they shaped the child. The idea of separating spirit from matter hadn't really caught on yet. So tonight, as you stretch out under your own sky, maybe think about the absurd intimacy medieval people had with the stars. For them, every part of life, yes, even the most private, pulsing, bodily parts, was under the microscope of the heavens. The stars weren't just watching, they were actively participating. You weren't alone in your bedroom. You were sharing it with Saturn, Mars, and possibly a disapproving moon. It's kind of romantic in a deeply invasive way. Let's say you're a young couple in 14th century France, staring deeply into each other's eyes, the rush of spring making everything feel urgent. You think tonight might be the night. You're ready, the wine is warm, the fire crackles gently. But then someone checks the moon calendar and panics. Because the moon just entered Scorpio, and everyone knows that conceiving under Scorpio is a celestial no-no. No matter how much you love each other, no matter how aligned your hearts may feel, you do not mess with the Scorpion. It's not superstition, it's survival. See, Scorpio in medieval astrology had a reputation, and not a fun, mysterious one like we assign it today. This sign was ruled by Mars, which already gave it some bad boy energy, but in medieval thought, it also belonged to the watery triplicity, meaning it was emotional, brooding, and capable of extreme hidden intensity. Combine those two concepts, and you've got something they truly feared: unseen, aggressive power. For this reason, it was seen as a dangerous sign for conception. Children conceived while the moon, or any major planet, passed through Scorpio were said to come out moody, deceptive, prone to lust, and possibly influenced by unclean spirits. Yes, that escalated quickly. Midwives and astrologers had a whole index of sign-based warnings, but Scorpio was the stuff of whispered conversations and protective charms. If you asked when not to try for a child, they didn't just say, "Oh, maybe avoid the plague this month." No, they said, "Whatever you do, don't do it under Scorpio, unless you want a child who challenges your authority, talks to animals and starts fires." These kids were believed to have intensity they couldn't control. Not strength, not courage, intensity. That vague, terrifying word. And this wasn't just theory. It had practical consequences. Midwives carried star charts. Monks copied lunar calendars with red ink warnings under Scorpio phases. Nobles had court astrologers on retainer not only for planning weddings, but also for ensuring their heir wasn't conceived on the wrong night. There are records of lords postponing their marriage consummations because Mars was conjunct the moon in Scorpio. And you can imagine how disappointed a noblewoman must have been when told, "Sorry, Your Highness, we can't do anything tonight. The stars say your child would have violent dreams." Of course, Scorpio wasn't alone in the do not conceive zone. Other signs had their own issues. Virgo was often considered too cold. Aquarius, too unstable. But Scorpio had the extra drama of being a fixed sign, meaning its qualities were thought to be persistent and unchangeable. If you conceived under Scorpio, the child's personality traits weren't just tendencies. They were locked in, fused into the bones, and you were probably stuck parenting a mini-dictator with anger issues and prophetic dreams. Now here's where it gets even weirder. Demons. In medieval thought, especially the kind infused with Christian cosmology, certain star alignments were thought to open spiritual portals. When the moon passed through Scorpio, it was said to create thin places, moments where malevolent entities could influence the material world. That included conception. Some texts warned that demons were especially active during Scorpio moons, attempting to enter the womb through the seed to create corrupted children. These weren't necessarily full-blown demon babies, though that was a fear, too, but children who would be spiritually burdened, born angry or anxious, always prone to sin. A child with a dark pull, as one Flemish midwife put it. Naturally, people had countermeasures. One common practice was wearing protective talismans during intercourse, if Scorpio was unavoidable. These might include pieces of silver inscribed with angelic names, sprigs of rosemary wrapped in linen and tucked under the mattress, or a gemstone like carnelian thought to repel infernal influence. There were also prayers, long, complicated ones, often directed at archangels, asking them to intervene and guard the womb during these risky hours. In more rural regions, people simply threw salt in the corners of the bedroom and hoped for the best. And as bizarre as all this sounds, there are records suggesting some of it worked. Or rather, some children born under clean astrological alignments were observed to be healthy and happy, reinforcing the idea that the stars were right. And when a Scorpio-born child turned out moody or difficult, that was just confirmation bias at work. The astrology was always correct. The problem was that you didn't respect it in time. Let's not forget the class divide here either. Nobility had access to astrologers and proper timing advice. Peasants, on the other hand, might only hear the local herbalist say, "Don't conceive on the black moon," with no real explanation. So naturally, if their child was born with a limp or a quick temper, it was blamed on the stars they couldn't afford to consult. Astrology, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was part science, part religion, and very much part social hierarchy. A historical fact for tonight. One manuscript from the 13th century lists Scorpio as responsible for infants who bite at birth. That is, children born with teeth, which was seen as a bad omen, often linked to witches or sorcerers. There are even recorded cases of noble families hiding such births or claiming the child was swapped by fairies. Better that than admit to a Scorpio moon conception. And here's a little fringe bonus. An apocryphal tale from Spain tells of a child born under Scorpio who was said to have a serpent's gaze. People believed he could paralyze chickens just by staring at them. He eventually became a travelling performer, proving once again that medieval people were just one weird prophecy away from show business. As for scholarly debate, modern historians can't agree on whether the Scorpio taboo was taken as literal or just used to explain misfortune after the fact. Was it a preventative tool or a coping mechanism? Some argue it was all superstition dressed up in scholarly robes. Others insist the astrologers sincerely believed they were performing vital work in protecting future generations from spiritual harm. Honestly, it was probably both. After all, if you don't know what causes birth defects or mental illness, it's pretty convenient to say, well, Mars was in Scorpio, there you go. So as you turn your eyes skyward tonight, or maybe just glance at the glow of your phone, remember that for centuries people lived in constant awe and fear of the constellations, especially Scorpio. Conceiving under its gaze wasn't just bad timing, it was flirting with fate. And fate in those days had claws. The moon is full tonight. High, round, and glowing like it knows something you don't. And if you were living in medieval Europe, you'd absolutely believe it does. In fact, you'd probably be staring up at it nervously, maybe clutching a charm or muttering a quiet prayer, because according to centuries of astrological medical theory, the moon doesn't just light your way through the night. It watches over your fertility, dictates your moods, governs your bodily fluids, and, in a very specific sense, decides if and when you'll be able to make a baby. Medieval astrologers were moon fanatics. Lunar phases were thought to govern nearly everything in the natural world, especially the womb. The female reproductive cycle was tied so closely to the moon that the two were often seen as mirror images. The average cycle lasted roughly 28 days. So did the moon's journey through its phases. Coincidence? Not to the medieval mind. To them, this wasn't just a poetic parallel, it was cosmic design. the moon didn't just reflect the rhythms of the womb, it commanded them. So let's say a woman's cycle begins with a new moon. That was considered auspicious, a clean start. It signalled that her fertility for that month might be strong, especially if conception took place during the waxing phase, the growing light representing vitality, strength, and increase. Full moons, on the other hand, were double-edged. They carried immense energy. Sure, and conception during a full moon was said to lead to passionate children with big personalities. But that same intensity also brought unpredictability. You might get a brilliant child, or one prone to madness. The stars never promised a refund. The waning moon? That was when most midwives advised against conception altogether. It was the period of decrease, of drawing inward, of letting go. To conceive under a waning moon was to fight the tide. Children born from such moments were thought to be physically weaker, more prone to illness, or emotionally melancholic, burdened with a soul too tired for this world. There were other lunar details to obsess over too, like the moon's position in the Zodiac at any given time. If the moon passed through fertile signs like Cancer or Taurus, it was considered a golden window. But if it wandered into barren signs, Virgo, Aquarius, Leo, then chances of conception dropped dramatically, at least according to the night sky logic of the time. Entire fertility calendars were structured around this lunar math. Noble families charted these signs out months in advance, planning their attempts accordingly. It wasn't about love, it was about timing. No point in trying for an heir under a Leo moon, after all, unless you wanted a child who refused to share toys and always needed to be the centre of attention. You'd think all of this would be exhausting, and you'd be right. But people clung to these beliefs because, frankly, the alternative was scarier. Childbirth was deadly, pregnancy was a gamble, miscarriages were common and poorly understood. In that kind of uncertainty, any sense of pattern or rhythm, any cosmic roadmap, even one scrawled across the moon's ever-changing face, felt like salvation. Here's a fun historical fact. Medieval medical texts often referred to the womb as a little moon within the body. The idea was that it mirrored the moon's own cycles and reacted to its phases like a tide reacts to gravity, which sure sounds poetic, but they meant it literally. Some physicians even claimed that the womb tilted slightly during full moons and opened itself to life during waxing phases. One 14th century manuscript includes an illustration of the womb as a moon-shaped vessel, complete with little stars drawn inside. It looks like a nightlight crossed with a wine goblet. Wild times. And it gets better, or weirder. There was a fringe belief in certain regions, particularly among rural communities, that the moon could see into your house. During full moons, pregnant women were advised to cover their bellies with linen and stay out of moonlight. The idea was that the moon's intense gaze could penetrate the child and cause spiritual disturbances. Eclipses were even worse. Expectant mothers were told to hide indoors, stay completely still, and avoid reflective surfaces. Mirrors, metal, even clear water. Some swore that moonlight during an eclipse could burn the soul of an unborn child. There are recorded cases of women hanging herbs, especially mugwort or vervain, in their windows during eclipses to repel these lunar rays. Others pinned small lunar amulets carved from bone or antler to their gowns to serve as decoys, fooling the moon into thinking it had already seen them. Yes, they tried to trick the moon. That's the level of belief we're dealing with. And, of course, there's scholarly debate over whether this was real doctrine or just colourful folk tradition. The educated elite, the medical astrologers and clerics, wrote extensively about lunar influence on fertility, but some dismissed the wilder claims as peasant superstition. Still, the overlap between learned and local knowledge was messy. A monk might roll his eyes at the idea that moonlight could warp a baby's spirit, but he'd still consult a lunar calendar before advising a noblewoman on when to attempt conception. Practical hypocrisy was the name of the game. Even in childbirth itself, the moon reigned supreme. Midwives watched its phases like hawks. Full moons were associated with early labour, too much energy, too much pull. Waning moons were feared for the opposite reason: slow, stalled births and dangerously quiet newborns. One midwife's journal, written in shaky Latin, notes that babies born during waning moons take longer to cry and longer still to live. There's a chill in that phrasing even now, so as you lie in bed tonight, Maybe you notice the moonlight spilling through your window. Maybe it seems brighter than usual. In the Middle Ages, that light wasn't just on Bionus, it was message, warning and power. It could bless your womb or haunt your dreams. It governed love, loss and legacy. And every month, it offered you a choice. Wait for the right moment, or risk bringing a child into the world against the rhythm of the sky. You're standing in the corner of a dim, fire-warmed room, packed with women in hushed motion. A labouring mother moans softly on a narrow, straw-padded bed, while a midwife mutters a string of words that sound half like Latin, half like something older. Hanging from a wooden peg nearby is not a crucifix or rosary, but a leather pouch containing herbs, a scrap of parchment, and a folded star chart. Because before this baby enters the world, the sky must give its permission. This is a birth, yes, but it's also an astrological negotiation. In the medieval birthing room, the stars were as much a part of the process as the midwife's hands. No respectable birth, especially among nobility, happened without at least a quick glance at the mother's natal chart. That was the map astrologers used to determine if this particular moment in the sky was safe, favourable, or potentially dangerous for both mother and child. It wasn't superstition, it was procedure. People genuinely believed that the exact alignment of the heavens at the time of birth could imprint itself on the baby, shaping temperament, health, lifespan, and even moral character. But here's the real twist. If the chart looked bad, some midwives would delay the birth. Yes, delay. With pacing, herbal infusions, and prayer, they'd try to slow things down just long enough for the stars to shift. If a baby was about to be born during a Saturn rising, known for cold, dry energy, often associated with melancholy and hard lives, they might attempt to buy time until Jupiter's hour came around. Jupiter was generous, wise, and warm, ideal for a future ruler, priest, or just someone who didn't cry for 6 years straight. In wealthier households, astrologer physicians might be consulted days in advance. These were men trained in the quadrivium, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music, who also dabbled in medicine and magic. They'd arrive with heavy books, brass instruments, and grave expressions. They weren't there to deliver the baby, they were there to tell the midwife when to deliver it. If a noblewoman's labour began at an astrologically dangerous hour, the physician might recommend administering calming herbs, like valerian or poppy, to stall the process. Or, in rarer cases, spicy stimulants to speed it up and reach a more favourable configuration. Because timing wasn't just about safety, it was about legacy. A royal baby born under a Mars-Mercury conjunction might be a skilled warrior and communicator, or a ruthless tyrant. But one born under Venus rising in Pisces, likely to be beloved, artistic and spiritually gifted. Star charts were read like prophecies, and if your child's looked dark, well, sometimes people made certain that child didn't make it. That's a darker corner of history, whispered about but rarely documented. Not every birth was welcomed. Some were feared. For the everyday woman, especially those without access to astrologers, the midwife filled this role. Many midwives were unofficial astrologers in their own right, trained by other women, informed by decades of observation, and fortified by practical experience. They tracked moon phases, knew the temperament of each zodiac sign, and kept small almanacs hidden in their toolkits. These midwives knew when a baby's arrival felt wrong, when the air was heavy and the stars too quiet. Some even whispered blessings aligned to the planetary hour, invoking Venus for daughters or Mars for sons. They weren't scientists by our standards, but they weren't guessing either, and it wasn't just the time of birth that mattered. The direction the baby faced during delivery was also sometimes interpreted through an astrological lens. If the baby emerged facing upward, under a Leo moon, it was said to signal a future leader. Face down under Capricorn, a labourer, quiet and dutiful, breech births during eclipses. That was a sign of spiritual disorder, often interpreted as divine punishment or celestial interference. Such children, if they survived, were sometimes marked, physically or socially, as different, special, or dangerous. Now here's a real historical gem. In a 15th century birthing manual from Italy, there's an entire section devoted to predicting a newborn's future profession, based on its planetary ruler at birth. Mars children were soldiers or blacksmiths. Saturn children, monks or gravediggers. Mercury babies became scribes, musicians, or, fittingly, astrologers. One line even claims, "He born when Mercury meets Mars shall speak quick and lie faster." You can just picture a medieval mother sighing, "Oh great, a lawyer." On the fringe side of things, some occult-leaning midwives believed they could rewrite bad star alignments by whispering planetary names into the baby's ear before its first cry. This was called planet naming, and while the church condemned it as borderline heresy, it was quietly practiced for centuries. They thought naming the planet you wanted to rule the child could override what the stars had dictated. It probably didn't help that this also involved a drop of wine on the baby's tongue and a pinch of ash under the tongue, two very unlicensed practices. Of course, the tension between this astrological birthwork and religious doctrine was ever present. Church authorities insisted that God alone shaped the soul, but astrology, especially when it promised healthier births, was hard to fight. One bishop famously called it a tool of the wise and a temptation of the proud. Midwives walked a tightrope between helpful and heretical, often invoking saints in one breath and planetary spirits in the next. That brings us to our scholarly debate of the night. Were these star-timed births a widespread practice, or just something preserved in elite records? Some historians argue that astrological birth timing was mostly for nobles and royals, whose lives were meticulously documented. Others say midwives across social classes used astrology all the time, just without the fancy Latin. Oral knowledge, after all, doesn't leave footnotes. So tonight, imagine yourself lying in that candlelit room, gripping a midwife's hand while the stars quietly take their positions. Your breath syncs with the rhythm of a cosmos you'll never fully understand. Outside, the night sky wheels onward. Inside, the moment you were born, or the moment you gave birth, is frozen in time, burned into the heavens like a secret signature. And from that moment on, your entire life, your body, your path, your purpose, was said to carry the echo of that celestial snapshot. Now imagine you're wearing 6 layers of velvet, sitting in a chilly stone hall with a fireplace that barely makes a dent in the draught, while an astrologer stands before you with ink-stained fingers, nervously flipping through charts. You're a queen, young, recently married, maybe even in love. But none of that matters. What matters is your womb, and whether the heavens have decided it's time for an heir. This isn't about romance. This is politics at its most intimate. Welcome to the Royal Conception Calendar. For medieval monarchs, fertility wasn't a private matter. It was national security. The line of succession had to be secure, preferably male, and ideally born under stars that promised strength, virtue, and divine favour. And so, astrologers, highly educated, respected men who often doubled as physicians, were tasked with more than just charting births. They were expected to schedule them. Or rather, to schedule the acts that would lead to them. It's easy to laugh at this now, picturing some poor nobleman being told, "Wait 2 more days. Venus is nearly in trine with the moon," while his wife raises an eyebrow and excuses herself to go read Psalms. But this was deadly serious. Dynasties depended on these calculations. If a child was born under a bad sign and turned out sickly, or worse, politically unpopular, the astrologer could be dismissed, banished, or in extreme cases, accused of sabotaging the crown. No pressure. One famous example comes from the court of King Henry II of England. His astrologers allegedly advised him to avoid any conjugal duties with Queen Eleanor during certain moon phases. Their reasoning? A Mars-Mercury opposition, which they believed would produce a rebellious child. Whether they timed things incorrectly or ignored the warning, they got Henry the young king, who led a revolt against his father. Historians argue whether the charts came before the rebellion or after, but the story stuck. Mars had cursed the cradle. Even earlier in Byzantium, imperial astrologers would draft conception maps for empresses, selecting windows of opportunity that aligned with favourable planetary aspects. Jupiter in the ascendant was ideal. It signalled royal potential. Venus in the 4th house, good for beauty and love. Saturn on the rise. Cancel the evening plans. Too risky. You don't want your heir to grow up humorless and prone to tragic poetry. What's fascinating is how personalised these royal horoscopes could be. Astrologers didn't just look at the stars in general. They compared the natal charts of both parents, seeking points of harmony and conflict. Did their moon signs align? Was there a beneficial conjunction between her Venus and his Mars? If not, conception might be postponed or, more awkwardly, spiritually realigned through prayer and ritual. That's code for incense, Latin chanting, and awkward eye contact. And let's not forget the expectations. A queen who failed to conceive after a few years wasn't just pitied, she was scrutinised. People whispered about curses, astrological imbalances, or divine disapproval. If she did have children, the timing and signs of their conception were dissected endlessly. Was the future king born under Leo? Excellent, noble, proud, destined to rule. Was it Pisces? Perhaps he'll be more of a poet. Better give him a sword early just in case. This obsession with cosmic legacy extended far beyond Europe. In Islamic and Persian traditions of the time, royal astrologers were similarly employed to select ideal moments for conception. These cultures had a robust astrological heritage, blending Greek, Indian and Arabic sources. The medieval Islamic scholar Abu Mashar, one of the most influential astrologers of the era, wrote about choosing hours of harmony for conception based on both planetary dignity and lunar mansions. These weren't just poetic ideas, they were instructions with real consequences. A historical fact for you. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly consulted astrologers when trying to conceive what would become her fourth child. The astrologers chose a date when Venus was in exaltation and Jupiter trined her natal moon. That child, Catherine of Aragon, who'd go on to marry Henry VIII and indirectly kickstart the English Reformation. So, maybe not the outcome they expected, but it sure was historically significant. Here's the fringe fact. One Renaissance-era text kept deep in a Florentine archive claims that a certain noble family only conceived their heirs when Mars was combust, literally burned by proximity to the sun. They believed it imbued their children with flame-born spirits. Their descendants reportedly included 2 pyromaniacs and a bishop who died from candle burns. Coincidence? Let's say yes. Of course, not everyone agreed on what made for a kingly horoscope. Some astrologers prioritised the sun sign, others said the moon revealed the soul. Still others believed the moment of conception mattered more than the birth itself, because it was the true beginning of life, the spark of ensoulment, as one 12th century text called it. That raised a thorny issue, though. How does anyone really know the exact moment of conception? Answer: they didn't. They guessed. They back-calculated. They consulted omens, dreams, even, yes, pulse changes in the woman, which some believed signalled conception had occurred. Spoiler, they were almost always wrong, and yet somehow it worked, at least in their minds. If a future king had the bravery of Mars and the eloquence of Mercury in his chart, it was because the stars had been honoured. If he turned out to be a tyrant or a weakling, then clearly someone had ignored the warnings. Astrology gave medieval rulers a strange kind of control. It was a way to pretend they had power over fate, over the whims of biology, over the terrifying randomness of childbirth. It gave them a story, a blueprint for destiny. And here's the debate that still lingers among scholars. Were these royal horoscopes genuinely believed, or were they clever tools for justifying outcomes after the fact? Was the astrologer picking the right hour, or retrofitting the chart once the child had a name and a sword? Some argue it was all political theatre. Others believe the astrologers were dead serious, and their patrons were even more so. So tonight, imagine you're lying in a royal bed, a little terrified, a little hopeful. Somewhere outside, a man with a beard and a compass is watching the stars and deciding your future child's fate. The room may be dim, but above, the heavens are burning with potential, waiting to decide whether your legacy will be born with a crown or a curse. You're sitting beside a fire trying to stay warm while an old man with a long tangled beard explains that the stars are cold tonight. Not metaphorically, actually cold. The air is dry, he mutters, the breath of Saturn. You're not sure what that means, but he says it like a curse. And in the Middle Ages, that's exactly what Saturn was. The planet of cold, of slowness, of silence and distance. And if you were trying to get pregnant or help someone do so, you did not want Saturn anywhere near your business. Not unless you were aiming for celibacy, or a child who wrote depressing poetry in a tower. Saturn in medieval astrology was the planetary buzzkill. It represented age, restriction, isolation, and sterility. Fertility? That was the domain of warm, moist planets like Venus and Jupiter, both generous, expansive, and sensually inclined. Saturn, by contrast, was thought to be cold and dry, the opposite of life. He ruled the bones, the spleen, the skin, dry, rigid, slow-developing parts of the body. And in the language of humoral theory, which was basically medieval medical dogma, cold and dry were the worst possible conditions for making babies. They snuffed out vitality like a draft through a wet blanket. When Saturn showed up prominently in someone's natal chart, particularly in the 5th house, which governed children, it was a bad omen. It could suggest delayed conception, miscarriage, or lifelong infertility. Some astrologers even claimed Saturn's presence in that region calcified the womb, whatever that meant. Spoiler, they didn't know either. If Saturn was retrograde, the interpretation got even darker. Retrograde Saturn was linked with impotence, malformed offspring, and conceiving without fruit. That last phrase appears in several texts and still sounds creepy centuries later. Now, imagine you're a medieval woman who's had trouble conceiving for several years. Your local astrologer, maybe even your physician, is called in to help. He sits you down, pulls out your natal chart and grimaces. Saturn in your 5th house, squared by Mars. That's double trouble. Mars adds fire and aggression, while Saturn slows and restricts. Together they might cancel each other out, or make your womb a battlefield. Not exactly reassuring. This is where things got creative. To counteract Saturn's influence, astrologers and midwives developed a whole buffet of celestial workarounds. You might be advised to wait until Saturn was weakened, when it was in a sign of its detriment, like Cancer or Leo, before attempting conception. Others suggested you wait for a Jupiter transit to balance out Saturn's gloom, or time your act to Venus's hour, layering sweet upon sour. Still others prescribed ritual baths in warmed milk mixed with fennel and rose petals during Jupiter's rising, all while burning a taper inscribed with Saturn's seal, because fire, they believed, softened the coldness of the elder planet. And if that didn't work, there were charms, lots of charms. Rings engraved with planetary sigils, pouches of wormwood, mandrake and silver hung around the hips. One odd recommendation from a 14th century herbal astrological manual involves tying a dried bat to your thigh for 3 nights under a waning moon to draw Saturn's cold outward. Look, they were trying. Interestingly, not all Saturn children were unwelcome, just inconvenient. Saturn was also the planet of deep wisdom, contemplation, and spiritual seriousness. If you weren't trying to raise a knight or queen, but maybe a monk or scholar, well then, Saturn might be your ally. Some families even wanted a Saturnine child, someone who would be content in a monastery, or who could spend decades transcribing religious texts without going mad. It's all about expectations. There's a real historical case involving a minor noble family in Saxony who believed one of their daughters was Saturn-blessed, meaning she was too spiritually serious for marriage. Instead of trying to marry her off, she had no suitors anyway. They sent her to a convent at 12. She eventually became known for her gloomy but strangely beautiful illuminated manuscripts. The stars didn't make her rich, but they gave her a job. Fringe time. In some rare traditions, Saturn wasn't seen as the enemy of fertility, but its delayed guardian. A belief circulated in small mystic circles that Saturn's influence didn't prevent life. It simply tested it. If a child was conceived under Saturn, they would be born late, underweight, or sickly. But if they survived, they were blessed with the endurance of ages. In other words, Saturn's children were slow to bloom, but indestructible. A tough sell to most parents, but oddly comforting if your baby took an extra week to arrive. Let's not forget Saturn's other side, the dark, cloaked figure holding a scythe. Saturn was also Kronos, the devourer of his own children in Greek myth. That story haunted medieval minds. It fed the fear that Saturn ate potential, that it sabotaged life before it even started. Some astrologers went so far as to say that Saturn hovering near a conception or birth chart indicated karmic baggage, or debts from former lives. Yep, we're talking past lives now. Because one bad planet wasn't enough. You might have already messed up last time around. Of course, not everyone believes Saturn was inherently evil. Some scholars, especially during the Renaissance, began to rehabilitate Saturn's image. They argued that he was not sterile but selective, Not cruel, but demanding. He didn't deny life, he just made sure it was hard won. But in the height of the medieval period, Saturn's name alone was enough to chill the room. And here's the scholarly debate of the night. How much did Saturn's reputation shape actual medical diagnosis? Some historians believe astrologers diagnosed infertility based on the stars, rather than symptoms. If you were trying and failing, they looked at your charts or Saturn and said, well, there it is. Others argue it was more symbolic. Saturn was a placeholder for unknown causes. We still do it today, in a way, only now we blame stress or lifestyle. Back then, it was cold air, dry blood, and a planet 746 million miles away. So tonight, as you settle under your blanket and stare into the darkness, maybe give a little nod to the old man in the sky. Saturn, the slow-walking, scythe-carrying shadow who terrified would-be parents for centuries, not because he hated life, but because he made you earn it, one chilly degree at a time. It's the hour just before sunrise, the sky still streaked with that dark indigo that makes everything feel secret and slightly forbidden. You're in a cramped kitchen tucked behind a stone wall, watching a woman boil herbs in a battered iron pot. The smell is sharp and earthy. Fennel, thyme, something bitter underneath. She's not making soup. She's making an aphrodisiac, timed precisely to the hour ruled by Jupiter. Because in medieval Europe, it wasn't enough to want a child. You had to earn it, with timing, intention, and occasionally, a potion that tasted like you were licking a forest floor. Welcome to the utterly strange world of planetary aphrodisiacs, a deeply awkward but very sincere effort to turn astrology into chemistry. The belief went like this. Each planet ruled certain herbs, stones, and even animal parts, and if you consumed them at the right hour on the right day while the right planet was dominant, you could bend the energies of the heavens to your will. Whether you were trying to conceive, rekindle desire, or just survive a long winter night in a marriage of political convenience, the stars had a recipe, and you were expected to follow it. Let's start with Jupiter, the big guy, warm, expansive, generous. He was the go-to planet when you wanted to enhance fertility, or ensure a bountiful conception. Herbs ruled by Jupiter included sage, mint, hyssop, and sweet marjoram. A typical fertility brew might involve steeping these in wine or goat's milk, stirring clockwise, and whispering a short invocation to Jupiter, something like, "Grant increase and joy." One 15th century French manual suggests rubbing sage-infused oil over the lower back and thighs during Jupiter's hour, to open the gates of the seed, which sounds both poetic and horrifying. Venus naturally was the star of sensuality. Her herbs leaned floral and sweet, rose, violet, yarrow, and sometimes even honey itself. If your problem was more about romance than reproduction, say a distant partner or fading passion, you'd look to Venus. Love potions made in her hour often contained powdered rose petals mixed with red wine and a trace of cinnamon. One especially awkward recommendation was to soak a clove of garlic in rosewater for 3 days, and then swallow it whole, to heat the blood and clear the heart. You probably just cleared the room. Then there was Mars. Yes, even Mars had a place in the fertility toolkit, though his role was more about vigour than tenderness. His herbs were spicy, sharp. Ginger, mustard, nettle. These were for those who needed a little extra fire in their blood. A Mars-ruled tonic might be drunk before attempting conception, especially if the man's natal chart showed signs of sluggishness, or what we'd now call low libido. However, astrologers warned against letting Mars dominate the moment too strongly. Too much Martian influence was said to make the act aggressive, conception unlikely, and the resulting child prone to violence or disobedience. Basically, don't let Mars drive the chariot. Planetary hours mattered almost as much as the ingredients themselves. Each day of the week was assigned to a planet, and each hour had its own mini-cycle, repeating the planetary pattern over and over. So, even on a Friday, Venus's day, there were Mars hours, moon hours, etc. If you were brewing a fertility potion, you wanted to start and finish it during a harmonious planetary hour. Venus for pleasure, Jupiter for conception, Moon for nurturing. Timing it wrong wasn't just bad etiquette. It could invite unfavourable influence. That was the polite way of saying, it might make your child weird. There's a historical note here that's almost too good. A 14th century English recipe book, half cookbook, half magical manual, included a section called For the Warming of Cold Men. It detailed how to mix pounded mint, saffron, goat's fat, and a pinch of powdered emerald, yes, emerald, into wine, and drink it beneath a waxing moon while lying naked on a bed of thyme. It then warned, "Do not lie with thy woman until an hour hath passed, else the seed will not catch." Imagine trying to explain that one to your spouse. "Darling, just one more hour of lying here with emerald breath. The stars demand it." Of course, most of these methods didn't work in any practical sense, but that wasn't really the point. They were rituals, embodied prayers to the cosmos. If nothing else, they gave people something to do, a sense of agency in a world where so much could go wrong so fast. Pregnancy wasn't guaranteed, and childbirth was a gamble every single time. When science fails you, when medicine offers only leeches and guesswork, a warm cup of sage wine under a lucky star feels like hope. Fringe time. In some rural parts of Germany and Bohemia, it was believed that sleeping with a certain stone under your pillow, lapis lazuli, ruled by Venus, could make you dream of the night you would conceive. If you saw stars in your dream, it was a good omen. If the stars blinked out or turned black, it meant delay or loss. This dream prophecy ritual was usually performed during Beltane or on the equinox, when fertility energies were said to be strongest. Whether it worked is unclear, but it certainly added a bit of suspense to bedtime. There were darker corners too. Some texts warned that incorrectly performed planetary rituals could turn affection into loathing, or result in a monstrous birth. Which sounds dramatic, but remember, medieval people were genuinely afraid of birth anomalies, believing them to be omens or signs of spiritual corruption. That's what made these astrological aphrodisiacs such high-stakes activities. Not just romantic gestures, but serious, sometimes risky attempts to engineer the ideal child. And here's your scholarly debate. Were these planetary recipes shared widely? Or were they limited to certain circles? Some argue they were passed through oral tradition among midwives and hedge witches. Others say they were luxury items, available only to the literate elite who could afford books and ingredients like saffron or powdered gemstones. The truth probably lives in both worlds. For every courtly astrologer whispering instructions over a velvet-draped bed, there was a village woman steeping herbs in a clay pot, hoping the stars heard her. So tonight, as you sip your own bedtime tea, hopefully without powdered emerald, consider this. For centuries people believed that love, fertility, and even passion itself could be coaxed into bloom with the right blend of starlight and root. That under the proper alignment, with the right herb and hour, you could not only make a baby, but maybe, just maybe, make magic. The sun is high, beating down on dusty stone roads and patches of stubborn summer weeds. It's July, and if you're living in medieval Europe, that means sweat, sour milk, and, if you're smart, 0 attempts at making babies. That's because, according to the astrologers, physicians and midwives of the time, certain months were absolutely cursed for conception, and July. That was the black hole of fertility calendars. Not just a bad time to plant crops, also a terrible time to plant anything in the womb. Medieval medical theory was as much about heat and moisture as it was about anatomy. Everything had to be in balance. Bodies were thought to contain 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each linked to elements and seasons. Summer, with its oppressive heat and dryness, threw everything into chaos. The blood became too hot, passions too inflamed, and the womb, they believed, was parched like scorched earth. Not exactly ideal for a new life to grow, and if the environment didn't stop you, the stars might. The sun sits in Cancer, and then Leo during July, signs ruled by the moon and the sun, respectively. While Cancer was technically a fertile sign, being watery and emotional, the heat of midsummer often overpowered its positive qualities. Leo, on the other hand, was considered barren by most astrologers. Hot, proud, and fire-aligned, Leo didn't offer the gentle conditions needed for successful conception. Children conceived under Leo were thought to be difficult, arrogant, or even tyrannical. Not the sort of personality you wanted ruling your estate or your kitchen. One astrological guide from 1325 goes hard on this. Beware the month of July, for the sun is strong and the earth gives no welcome. The seed shall dry, the womb shall resist, and the child, if made, shall be ever quarrelsome. So, there's your medieval horoscope for your future toddler. July wasn't alone. Other months were eyed with suspicion, especially depending on their planetary rulers. November was considered risky due to Scorpio's rule and the onset of cold, bad for sperm vitality allegedly. February, with Aquarius in charge, was said to invite instability. But July was the universal red flag. So much so that some couples made a point of avoiding each other during that time, with written records of noble women retiring to separate quarters for the entire month to avoid any risky encounters. Maybe they just didn't like their husbands, but hey, astrology gave them an excuse. And if a pregnancy did happen in July? People held their breath. Midwives made additional preparations, consulted the stars more frequently, and sometimes performed extra rituals to offset the heat's supposed impact. This could include burying a small clay charm under the threshold of the birthing room, carved with water symbols to cool the path of life, or administering herbal tinctures designed to moisten and soothe the womb, rose water, barley tea, and even a chilled compress made of mint leaves and sheep's wool. Science? No. Symbolism? Absolutely. Now here's a lesser-known detail. Some believed that children conceived during bad months would carry the season's spirit within them. Summer conceptions, especially in July, were said to produce children who burned too hot, quick to anger, excessive in appetite, and prone to lust. Winter conceptions, cold children, distant, thinkers rather than feelers. It was all part of the medieval logic that your origin shaped your nature, both biologically and cosmically. And let's not forget lunar placement. If the moon was waning during July, that doubled the trouble. A hot, dry month paired with a dying moon made for the worst possible time to conceive. Some texts refer to this combo as the famine of the stars, a dramatic term for a window in which heaven offers no blessings. Midwives would advise couples to wait until at least the first quarter moon of August, when the air began to shift and the stars allegedly softened their stance. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some pregnancies were accidents, some intentional acts of defiance, and some the result of not having the luxury to plan. Peasants didn't have astrologers or quiet bedrooms. They had hard ground, shared walls, and a lot of stress. For them, the idea of avoiding conception in July was laughable. But among the educated and the elite, these seasonal taboos shaped decisions in real, tangible ways. You were taught not just how to live, but when to live. Timing was morality. And here's a historical fact to chew on. The Taquinum Sanitatis, a 14th century health handbook based on earlier Arabic sources, includes an entire section on proper months for generation. It recommends March and April, spring, ruled by gentle planets, warns strongly against July and December, and includes a helpful table of moon phases alongside agricultural planting guides. Because yes, your sex life was listed right next to when to sow onions, all part of the same natural cycle. Now for something on the fringe. In some Italian towns, people believed July conceptions led to cursed pregnancies unless the couple performed a ritual involving dousing their bed with spring water before lying together. In some cases, this became a pre-sex routine, literally soaking the sheets to cool the fire of Leo. It probably didn't do much for the mood, or the mattress. So where does the scholarly community stand on all this? Some argue these seasonal prohibitions were mostly symbolic, a poetic way to teach people about rhythm and balance. Others say they were dead serious, tied into larger medical systems that aim to regulate every bodily function. There's even debate about how far back this thinking goes. Some trace it to Greco-Roman humoral theories, others to Babylonian fertility calendars. What's clear is that people didn't trust the sun to just shine. It could scorch, it could sabotage, it could make your baby weird. So as July winds down outside your window, think about all the people over centuries who looked at this exact time of year and thought, not tonight, not this month, not under these stars. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a cosmic warning. And love, in that world, waited for cooler air, softer light, and a more favourable moon. It's the middle of the night and your fever won't break. You've been coughing for days, your body rattling like a loose cartwheel, and your family has finally called for a physician. He arrives not with potions or plasters, but with a wax-sealed book, a handful of iron instruments, and a well-used astrolabe. He pulls up a stool, lights a candle, and begins consulting the stars. Not because he doesn't care whether you live or die, but because he's trained to believe that your lungs, your liver, And yes, your chances of ever having children are all entangled with the constellations. This is your doctor, but he's also your astrologer. In medieval Europe, the line between physician and astrologer was almost non-existent. The most learned men, those trained at universities like Salerno, Paris or Bologna, were expected to master both fields. Astrology wasn't an optional elective or some fringe curiosity. It was core curriculum. The logic was simple. If the body was a microcosm of the universe, then the stars were as important to your health as your pulse. And when it came to fertility, forget it. No self-respecting physician would diagnose or prescribe without first consulting the heavens. This dual identity, the astrologer-physician, wasn't some quiet secret. It was openly celebrated. In fact, the very first page of many medieval medical texts featured planetary charts, linking organs to zodiac signs. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the throat, Gemini the arms, and so on down to Pisces and the feet. The reproductive organs, as you've heard before, belonged to Scorpio. But that wasn't just trivia, it was a literal guide to treatment. If your patient was struggling to conceive, you didn't just ask questions and examine bodily symptoms. You checked the placement of the moon. You mapped out their natal chart, and you probably prescribed something with a planetary association, like fennel, ruled by Mercury, or mugwort, favoured by the moon. So let's say a couple comes in seeking help. They've been married for a year, no children. The husband is healthy, the wife seems normal by the standards of the time, which is to say, she hasn't died of anything yet. The physician takes their birth charts, overlays them, and searches for clues. Are their moons in opposition? Is Mars squaring Venus? Is Saturn lurking in one of their fifth houses like a moody uncle at a wedding feast? If so, he might determine that their stars are in conflict, and recommend either ritual abstinence, planetary prayers, or more tangibly, sex during specific lunar hours. If the chart looks promising, though, he might offer more practical advice: herbs to take, times to try, talismans to wear. One physician's manual from the 13th century recommends that men with Mars in Aries, a bold placement but also impulsive, abstain for 3 days before trying to conceive, lest their vigour rise too quickly and not last the needed span. There's an entire paragraph detailing how too much heat in the moment of conception can lead to boys who are rash and hot of temper, prone to violence and disobedience. These men weren't just trying to make babies, they were trying to sculpt souls. Of course, some of these physician astrologers genuinely believed in their work, others likely played along because the public demanded it. After all, it's easier to swallow bitter herbs if someone tells you the moon's blessing them. And when things went wrong, when pregnancies failed, when infants were lost, it was far easier to say, the stars were unkind, than to admit ignorance or fault. In a way, astrology served as medical malpractice insurance. Here's a little historical fact to set the scene. King Charles V of France kept a personal physician who also served as court astrologer. This man, Thomas de Mussis, famously delayed the conception of one of Charles's children based on an inauspicious lunar eclipse. Whether the child was actually delayed or just didn't happen right away is unclear, but what's certain is that even kings trusted their physicians to consult more than just thermometers. Well, if thermometers existed. And here's where it gets delightfully fringe. Some astrologer physicians believed they could retroactively explain why someone was infertile by studying their moment of first breath. Not their conception or birth, but the exact moment they inhaled air. That breath, they said, sealed the stars within the body, marking the true beginning of life's journey. If your first breath occurred during a Mercury-Saturn square, that might have cursed your lungs and your seed. And yes, there were breath charts, entire books of them. There were also debates, scholarly and otherwise, about whether celestial influence trumped divine will. Could a physician override a bad horoscope through intervention, or was the chart fixed from birth? Some schools of thought insisted that astrology merely described the world, not dictated it. Others believed it was as binding as gravity. That tension hung in the background of every treatment, every herbal recipe, every nervous couple leaning forward as a man in robes adjusted his astrolabe and frowned. And let's talk bedside manner. Astrologer physicians weren't just calculating, they were poetic. A diagnosis might include phrases like, "The stars favour thee but delay thy joy," or "Thy womb is as the moon, full yet veiled." There are recorded cases where patients reported more comfort from these words than from the treatments themselves, because when your world is governed by mystery and danger, sometimes it helps to know someone's watching the sky for you. Of course, not everyone loved the practice. The church grew increasingly uneasy with astrologer physicians, especially as their predictions gained weight. If a doctor claimed a woman's chart showed she'd never conceive, was that fate or blasphemy? And if he was right, was it medicine or magic? There were occasional burnings, excommunications, and public debates. But mostly, the practice persisted. Quietly, persistently, effectively. Because even if the herbs failed, even if the stars stayed silent, people still wanted to believe someone somewhere had a map. So tonight, picture yourself lying in a narrow bed, fevered or hopeful, while a man sits beside you, flipping through parchment and tracking Mars with a crooked finger. He's not just your healer, he's your interpreter of destiny, and whatever happens next, life or loss, joy or silence, he'll tell you the stars had something to say about it. It's early morning and the town is just waking, church bells tolling lazily, livestock grumbling in pens, and down a narrow alleyway, a woman is quietly fastening a leather cord around her waist. At its centre hangs a small round pouch, tied tight with a knot that's been blessed under a waxing moon. Inside, crumbled herbs, a sliver of red jasper, a bit of parchment marked with strange symbols. She calls it her protection. The midwife calls it a talisman. The priest, if he ever found out, would probably call it heresy. But no one's asking him, because this little pouch isn't just jewellery, it's contraception, sort of. Welcome to the bizarre and surprisingly resourceful world of talismanic birth control, where planetary magic met reproductive planning long before the invention of latex or the pill. It's not exactly science, it's not exactly sorcery, but for many medieval women, especially those without wealth or social power, it was something they could do, a charm, a safeguard. A way of saying, not this month, stars, try again later. The logic behind these talismans was rooted in planetary correspondence. Each planet ruled certain metals, stones, animals, herbs, and hours. By combining the right materials under the right astrological conditions, you could allegedly create an object that either encouraged or discouraged fertility. Jupiter for increase, Saturn for delay, Venus for desire, the moon for menstruation. Contraceptive talismans were designed to close the gate, often using Saturnian symbols, since Saturn, as you'll recall, was the cold and dry planet of restriction. These charms varied wildly. One might contain dried rue and peppercorns, stitched into linen embroidered with astrological glyphs. Another could be more elaborate, like a bronze medallion engraved with a specific planetary seal, worn between the breasts or hidden under the bed. One 15th century Italian grimoire details how to create a womb-lock talisman using beeswax, saffron, and a pin taken from a burial shroud, crafted during Saturn's hour and buried for 3 nights beneath a fig tree. Let's just say this wasn't a weekend project, and they weren't always worn. Some talismans were placed under pillows sewn into mattress seams, or even suspended above the doorway. There's a particularly peculiar tradition from parts of northern France that involved placing an egg, hollowed out and filled with ash and rosemary, on the windowsill each night during a woman's fertile window, to confuse the moon and trick the womb into forgetfulness. Whether it worked or not, it certainly added flair to the bedroom decor. What's fascinating is that many of these practices coexisted with Christian belief. Some women wore crosses alongside their talismans. Prayers were sometimes spoken while preparing the ingredients, sometimes to saints, sometimes to celestial powers. A charm might be invoked in the name of Mary under the eye of Venus, blending the sacred and the profane without apology. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was survival. In a world with limited options and high stakes, why not use every tool in the box? And while these talismans were sometimes crafted by women themselves, they were often provided by midwives, herbalists, or what polite society called wise women. These were not witches in the broomstick sense, but local healers who knew how to read moon charts and dose herbs without killing anyone. Their knowledge was passed through generations, not written down but memorized, whispered, lived. They were the ones who told you which herbs to avoid if you didn't want to get pregnant, wild carrot, penny royal, and which stars to wait for if you were trying. Sometimes, of course, things went the other way. Fertility talismans were also a thing, crafted with warming herbs, sweet-smelling woods, and planetary seals aligned with Jupiter, Venus, or the Moon. One especially hopeful charm involved tying 7 dried apple blossoms, collected under a waxing moon, to a blue silk ribbon and wearing it around the thigh for a full lunar cycle. It sounds romantic until you realise it also had to be anointed with first morning water, meaning you had to pee on it. Rituals don't always smell nice. Historical fact of the night. In 1423, a midwife in Strasbourg was accused of sorcery for giving a woman a contraceptive charm made from wolf's fur and lead. The woman wore it on her ankle and swore it worked for over a year until her husband found it, and thinking it was cursed, threw it into a river. 9 months later, she gave birth to twins. Coincidence? Maybe. But the story spread fast. And for your fringe detail, there's a half-translated fragment from a now-lost alchemical codex that describes a mirror of barrenness, a hand-sized polished silver disc engraved with lunar symbols. It was said that if a woman gazed into it under a waning crescent and whispered her name 3 times, her womb would turn as still as a stone. There's no record of anyone actually using it, but the fact that someone imagined it says a lot about the desire for agency over reproduction, at any cost. Scholarly debate on these talismans tends to split along predictable lines. Some historians classify them as pure superstition. Creative, yes, but ultimately powerless. Others argue they held enormous psychological significance. They gave women a sense of control, which might itself influence conception rates. Still others point out that many talisman ingredients were mildly contraceptive, or even abortifacient. So, were they magic? Or were they proto-pharmaceuticals hiding behind the veil of astrology? The line was, and still is, blurry. But what's clear is that these talismans represented an effort to negotiate with fate, to set boundaries with the universe. Whether worn under a dress or buried in a field, they whispered the same quiet plea, not now. And sometimes, the stars listened. So as you drift towards sleep, maybe picture that small pouch tucked under a mattress centuries ago. A few herbs, a bit of metal, a name scrawled in hopeful ink. It didn't buzz or blink, but it held a kind of power all its own. If not to block life, then at least to say, for once, that the choice might be yours. The stars are spinning above a silent field, and somewhere just beyond the treetops, a sliver of Venus glows in the early morning sky. It's delicate, almost faint, but unmistakable. That soft, pale light that always arrives just before dawn or lingers after sunset. In medieval Europe, that glow wasn't just a pretty sight. It was a signal, a sign, a sort of divine wink from the cosmos. If you were trying to conceive, this was your moment. And if you were a woman, this was the star that claimed you. Because Venus didn't just rule beauty and love, she ruled fertility itself, and her mark was traced in more ways than one, onto the bodies and charts of those who hoped to bring life into the world. Enter the star of Venus, not just the planet, but the symbol, a 5-pointed star, also known as the pentagram. It was drawn from the astronomical path Venus makes as it moves across the sky. Over the course of 8 years, Venus forms a near-perfect pentagonal pattern when charted from Earth. Medieval astrologers were fascinated by this. They called it the Rosa Veneris, the Rose of Venus, and believed it held the key to understanding not only feminine energy, but the deeper mechanics of life itself. Women trying to conceive might be advised to wear a pendant shaped like the 5-pointed star, or to bathe under the open sky on the morning when Venus reached a certain height. The pentagram wasn't yet burdened with the occult or sinister meanings it would later acquire. In the medieval mindset, it was a symbol of balance and harmony, the 5 points representing the classical elements: earth, air, fire, water, and spirit, or the 5 senses, or even the 5 stages of a woman's reproductive life: maiden, lover, mother, crone, and ancestor. It all depended on who you asked, and how much wine they'd had. For the astrologer physicians of the time, the Rosa Veneris wasn't just a mathematical curiosity, it was sacred geometry, proof that the heavens were ordered, elegant, and full of purpose. The shape found its way into fertility texts, often embedded subtly into the margins, where scribes might sketch tiny stars beside recipes or herbal instructions. A midwife in southern Italy might advise a woman to trace the pentagram on her belly with rose oil while lying beneath the light of Venus on a spring morning. If the ritual was performed with a gentle heart and clean intent, the womb was said to become more receptive. Of course, there were entire branches of astromedical law built around Venus's positions. When Venus was in Pisces, she was exalted, considered her most potent and generous state. Conception during that time, astrologers claimed, would likely result in girls of extraordinary beauty or boys with softness of spirit. Venus in Aries, on the other hand, was less favourable, too aggressive, too fiery. A child conceived then might be hot-headed, or worse, prone to vanity. And Venus in retrograde, absolute disaster. Many texts flat out advised couples to abstain during Venus retrograde, warning that it could confuse the soul entering the womb and lead to offspring divided of desire and slow of affection. That's medieval speak for emotionally unavailable. But the influence of the star of Venus extended beyond conception. It played a role in midwifery, in the timing of births, and in recovery afterward. Venus ruled copper and sweetness and softness, qualities believed to promote healing. After childbirth, some women wore copper bracelets etched with the pentagram, believing it would speed uterine recovery and protect against womb wandering, a condition medieval doctors swore happened when the uterus went rogue inside the body. No, it's not real, but they really thought it was. A recorded case from a 14th century English parish chronicles the story of a woman who miscarried 3 times in a row and then visited a mystic who instructed her to perform a Venus invocation ritual under the new moon. She was told to draw the pentagram in ash on her bed frame and plant wild rose beside her threshold. 9 months later, she gave birth to a healthy daughter whom she named Stella. The name caught on in that region as a good luck name for girls. Stella, the starborn. Now for a bit of Fringe. There's a curious manuscript fragment found in the ruins of a monastery in northern France that details the Venus mirror ritual. It describes placing a bowl of water in the moonlight on a Venus-ruled night, then staring into the reflection of the planet's light until you see a shape form, a flower, a flame, a face. Whatever you see first is your conception omen. One noted result: a woman saw a fish and later gave birth to twins with webbed toes. Coincidence? Probably. But that fish symbol became a local superstition, and for years people avoided fish on Venus nights, just in case. Not everyone accepted the power of Venus, of course. The Church was perpetually nervous about too much attention on celestial bodies, especially ones named after pagan gods. Venus in particular, associated with love, sex, and pleasure, was viewed with suspicion. Her rituals were easily framed as sinful indulgence or worse, witchcraft. By the late medieval period, any woman caught drawing pentagrams, no matter how innocent, risked being accused of sorcery. That's when the symbol's darker associations began to take root, slowly shifting its public image from sacred geometry to a cult sigil. Still, the deeper belief lingered in quieter circles. Venus's cycle, the 8-year dance that formed the pentagram in the sky, became a metaphor for patience and timing. Midwives would say, "Good things take 5 points," a cryptic little nod to Venus's pattern. And some women kept private journals tracking Venus's movements, noting when they felt most fertile, most passionate, most connected. Whether it worked scientifically was beside the point. It worked emotionally. It gave the sky a face, a rhythm, a reason. And so, the scholarly debate. Was the star of Venus merely mathematical ornamentation, or was it genuinely seen as a fertility guide? Historians argue both sides. Some say it was symbolic, a coincidence turned myth. Others point to how widely the pattern appeared, in architecture, in embroidery, and secret corners of manuscripts, as evidence that people truly revered its power. In truth, it likely straddled the line. A star, a shape, a signpost, a little cosmic breadcrumb trail for those willing to follow. So tonight, when you spot that faint sparkle just before sunrise, remember, to the women of the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a planet, it was a promise, a compass, a hope written in the sky, tracing a secret rose above the world, petal by glowing petal. You're sitting in a smoky hall where the fire burns low and shadows stretch too far, the kind of room where things creak that shouldn't. A woman clutches her swollen belly, eyes wide with fear, not from pain, but because she saw something in the sky. A strange flicker behind the moon, a crooked star where there shouldn't be one. The midwife mutters under her breath and slips a sprig of rue under the bed. Everyone pretends to ignore it, but no one's really breathing, because something has shifted. The heavens aren't right, and in this world that can only mean one thing: hell might be near the womb. Medieval minds didn't see the body as separate from the cosmos. It was a mirror, a fragile shell waiting to be shaped or shattered by forces far beyond it. And when things went wrong with pregnancy, when there was miscarriage, stillbirth, or strange deformity, the first suspects weren't bacteria or genetics. No one knew what those were. Instead, eyes turned upward and downward at once, to the sky and to the abyss. Because demons, they believed, were astrologically scheduled, and some planetary configurations were their invitations. In particular, planets like Saturn and Mars were considered malefic, meaning harmful, hostile, cold, or destructive. A strong presence of these planets in a woman's birth chart, or hovering over her at the time of conception, was enough to stir anxiety. But it was when certain alignments occurred, like a full moon in Scorpio or a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in a dark house, that fear truly took root. These moments were said to open the gates to spiritual corruption, allowing malevolent forces to interfere in the act of creation. One popular belief was that demons could ride the seed at the moment of conception if the stars were aligned just wrong. This meant the child would be touched not by divine breath, but by shadow, resulting in birth defects, stillbirth, or worse, a child with a twisted soul. The signs of such a thing weren't always physical. Sometimes it was just a look in the infant's eyes, a cry that was too shrill, a refusal to take milk. "He is not ours," one mother was recorded saying after such a birth. "He came through me, but not from me." Astrology offered a kind of logic to this horror. If you knew which planetary hours were vulnerable, you could avoid them. If you understood which zodiac signs acted as thresholds, you could chart a safer course. Scorpio, of course, was a favourite scapegoat. So was Capricorn, which was linked to deformities, particularly of the legs and spine. A woman who conceived under Capricorn was said to risk giving birth to a child with limbs bent against nature. Aquarian conceptions, especially during eclipses, were associated with the mind. Strange speech, silence, seizures. If any of this happened, no one asked what the mother ate or drank. They asked who read her stars. Now here's where things get eerily specific. Certain star patterns were associated with monstrous births, a catch-all phrase for any child born with a visible difference. There's a document from the 13th century cataloguing a series of these events. A child born with 3 arms under a Mars-Saturn opposition, a child with no eyes during a lunar eclipse, a girl born with a thick patch of fur across her back during a night Venus was darkened by Mars. Whether these were exaggerations, misunderstandings, or real anomalies doesn't change the takeaway. To them, these weren't medical mysteries. They were punishments, or warnings. There's also the idea of astral contagion, the belief that a woman could be infected by demonic influence during conception if she passed under the wrong star or had impure thoughts, while Venus was retrograde. Yes, even your thoughts had to be astrologically timed. Some texts instructed women to sleep with a protective herb bundle, whisper a planetary prayer, and avoid reflective surfaces during certain planetary hours. Mirrors and still water were considered portals, vulnerable to spiritual distortion. If a demon couldn't enter the womb directly, it might send a dream, or a shadow, or a whisper. This wasn't all peasant superstition either. Some of the most respected astrologers of the time wrote about it openly. Guido Bonatti, a major figure in 13th century astrology, warned that improper star alignments at the moment of conception could invite astral sin. He didn't mean ordinary temptation, he meant corruption that began in the womb and stained the soul. There were even attempts to classify these corruptions by planetary influence. Saturnian children were cold and cruel, Martian children, violent. Moon-corrupted births often ended in early death or madness. It was astrology, but it read like spiritual triage. Now for your historical tidbit, in 1382, a midwife in Prague reportedly refused to assist in a birth because the child was conceived during an eclipse. She claimed she'd seen the demon's tail in the sky and warned the parents that delivering such a child would curse the household. The baby was born anyway, with no obvious problems, but died suddenly at 3 months. The family was shunned for years. The midwife became a minor celebrity, and the story became part of the local mythology, warning others never to trust the stars when they go dark. Here's your fringe fact. Some monks kept celestial warning tables, astrological calendars that outlined unclean days, when any conception or birth was to be avoided. These included not just eclipses or bad planetary aspects, but also feast days associated with saints known for suffering or martyrdom. One monk wrote, "Let no soul be born on St. Apollonia's eve, lest her teeth ache all her life." That's specific. There's a deep academic debate around all this. Were these demonic interpretations genuine belief, or post hoc justifications for what couldn't be explained? Did astrology provide a scapegoat for grief, or was it an attempt to impose order on chaos, however flawed? Some historians argue that astrology was a tool of mercy, letting mothers believe their losses weren't their fault. Others point out that it too often blamed the woman anyway, her chart, her body, her timing. So tonight, think about that flickering star just above the trees. It might be Mars, it might be Saturn, it might be Venus, smudged by passing clouds. Now imagine you're waiting to become a mother, and someone tells you the shape of that star will determine whether your child lives, or what kind of soul they'll carry if they do. Terrifying, yes. But in a world without microscopes, it might have felt like the only way to explain the inexplicable. It's the kind of evening that hums quietly under your skin. Clear skies, a sliver of moon just starting to glow, and somewhere off in the hills, a shepherd's pipe echoing in the distance. You're walking beside a woman who clutches a small scrap of parchment with trembling hands. On it is a scroll of symbols, her name, her birth date, the rising sign at the hour of her first breath. She's going to see the astrologer, not for herself exactly, but for the child she doesn't have yet. She wants to know what kind of baby she'll have, a boy or a girl, and when she should conceive if she wants to choose. Welcome to one of the more oddly specific services offered by medieval astrology, gender prediction and even gender influence. That's right. Not only could an astrologer tell you what kind of baby you were likely to have, but with the right alignment and timing, they claimed they could help you aim for a particular gender. This wasn't some vague wives' tale whispered over firewood. It was a full-fledged system, with charts, rules, and occasionally a talisman or two. The logic started, as always, with the stars. Masculine planets, like the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter, were said to encourage the birth of male children. Feminine ones, Venus and the Moon, were associated with daughters. Mercury, ever the trickster, could swing either way depending on its aspects at the time of conception. If Mercury leaned toward Mars, it might indicate a boy. If it danced closer to Venus, it tipped toward a girl. This made Mercury the wild card, chaotic, versatile, and slightly untrustworthy. Like that one friend who RSVP'd maybe to your wedding. Astrologers would begin by studying both parents' natal charts, looking at the placement of the moon, the ascendant sign, and the position of the fifth house, which ruled children. If all signs pointed to strong masculine energy, say Aries rising Sun in Leo, and Mars transiting the ascendant, then a male child was predicted. Conversely, a dominance of Venus or Moon in Cancer would suggest a girl. But prediction was only half the job. The real business was in planning. Parents, especially nobles, didn't just want children, they wanted sons, and they wanted them yesterday. So the astrologer would select an auspicious day and hour for conception, one with masculine planetary energy if a boy was desired. The couple would be told to wait until Jupiter's hour on a Tuesday, or Mars's hour on a Sunday night, depending on the planetary alignments. In some cases, they were even told what direction to face during the act. North and east were masculine, south and west, feminine. Yes, this sounds like someone desperately trying to write a cosmic user manual for sex, but it was deadly serious to them. Of course, these suggestions weren't just about planets and timing, they also leaned on humoral theory. The idea was that hot, dry conditions in the body favoured male conception, while cold, wet conditions produced girls. This meant that men were advised to heat the blood with spicy food, wine, and vigorous movement beforehand, ideally with Jupiter overhead and the moon in a masculine sign. Women were told to dry the womb by fasting, bathing in rosemary, and sleeping under thick wool blankets. If that sounds wildly uncomfortable, that's because it was. And when all else failed, there were charms and prayers. One Italian recipe advised women to wear a strip of linen soaked in eagle's blood, don't ask, under their dress for a full lunar cycle if they hoped for a boy. Another text from Germany suggests chanting a specific series of syllables, Ioha emas ataris, under the light of a waxing moon to ensure a daughter who would walk with grace and speak with clever tongue. A little light spell casting in between chores. Historical record? Absolutely. A 13th century English noblewoman wrote in a private letter that her astrologer advised her to lie first on the right side, under Jupiter's hour, with rosemary burned beside the bed, that a boy might come of it. The resulting child did happen to be a boy, and the story was passed down as proof of the method's success. Whether it was luck or the stars or just biology, didn't matter. People believed. Now here's where things get truly fringe. Some astrologers believed the stars could not only influence the child's gender, but also their temperament and sexuality. A boy conceived under strong Venus influence might be too soft, or given to the female arts, while a girl born under Mars might be too bold, a warrior of the tongue. These descriptions reflect more about medieval anxieties than medical realities, but they influenced everything from parenting to social roles. If your daughter was too assertive, you might be told, well, but she was born during Mars hour in Leo, what did you expect? There's even one curious text from an early 15th century Spanish astrologer who claimed that gender could change in the womb based on later planetary transits. He argued that a child conceived as a boy could turn to the female way if Venus gained prominence during the mother's second trimester. Of course, no one could see this happening. Ultrasounds were 600 years away, but it gave people something to obsess over. Every dream, every craving, every strange movement in the womb was read as a sign that the stars were shifting. Naturally, not everyone agreed on these methods. Some theologians warned against trying to manipulate the will of God through astrology, declaring that only he could choose the soul's nature. Others saw no conflict. If God wrote the stars, then reading them was simply reading his design. But the debate raged in university lecture halls and peasant kitchens alike. Was gender determined by divine spark, bodily humour, or celestial angle? Modern historians debate the sincerity of these practices. Were astrologers really helping couples plan their child's gender, or were they using birth charts to explain things after the fact? Some suggest the rituals were more psychological than practical, providing structure, hope, and a sense of control in a wildly uncertain world. Others argue that astrologers genuinely believed they could tip the cosmic scales. Either way, the clients believed, and sometimes that belief was all that mattered. So as you sit with the knowledge that medieval parents once tried to influence gender by aligning themselves with planetary hours and whispering Latin at the moon, consider what they were really doing, grasping at patterns, hoping that the universe might be coaxed, even just a little, into granting them the child they dreamed of. It wasn't about control. It was about reaching for order in a world where life and death could turn on a fever, a famine, or a flicker in the stars. It's late. Candlelight dances on the rough wood of a narrow kitchen table where two people sit hunched over a piece of parchment. It's not a love letter, or a tax notice, or a saint's prayer. It's a moon chart, hand-copied from an almanac, annotated in the margins with clumsy Latin and a few anxious question marks. They aren't trying to get pregnant, they're trying not to, because in a world where contraception was frowned upon, dangerous, or simply non-existent, some people turned their eyes skyward for answers. And thus we arrive at the awkward, fascinating world of medieval celestial contraception. Let's be clear right away. There were no birth control pills, no latex, no scientific ovulation tracking apps glowing on anyone's nightstand. But that didn't stop people from trying to control fertility. While herbal methods existed, and we'll come back to those, astrological contraception was a genuine category of its own. You might call it abstinence by moonlight, or maybe divinely timed frustration. The theory began, as usual, with lunar phases. The moon was considered the ultimate regulator of female fertility, believed to rule both menstruation and conception. A woman's moon cycle was mapped directly onto the lunar calendar, and certain phases were thought to be more or less fertile. Full moons, waxing crescents, and certain lunar signs like Cancer, Taurus and Pisces were considered high-risk times if you were trying not to conceive. Waning moons, dark moons and dry signs, Gemini, Virgo, Aquarius, were believed to reduce the likelihood of pregnancy. So if a couple wanted to enjoy intimacy without risking conception, they'd consult the moon. If it was waning in a barren sign, they had a green light. If it was full in Cancer and Jupiter was hanging around in the 4th house, no dice. That night was for sleeping back to back and praying for self-control. But it wasn't just about the moon. There were also unfruitful hours in the planetary week. Each day and hour was ruled by a planet, and if you timed things during a Saturn hour or a Mercury hour, especially on a Wednesday or Saturday, it was thought to suppress fertility. The logic? Saturn was cold and dry, which hindered conception. Mercury, being fast-moving and fickle, was believed to scatter the seed. Not exactly romantic imagery, but it gave anxious couples a kind of calendar to live by. There were even instructions for timing sexual activity down to the hour, a level of detail that seems bizarre until you remember that conception, to them, was not just biological, but cosmic. The position of the moon, the alignment of Venus, the direction the couple faced, all could affect the outcome. Facing east, favourable; west, not so much. Conception was imagined as a kind of energetic contract between the body and the sky, and if you could time it right, you could cancel the agreement. Historical fact break. The Picatrix, a massive 11th century Arabic text on astrology and magic that later made its way into European hands, includes entire chapters on limiting conception by astrological means. It outlines specific hours and planetary combinations to avoid, and even suggests talismans that can cool the blood or harden the womb temporarily. Some of these involve rather ominous materials like lead, nightshade, and menstrual blood. So, not exactly FDA approved. But for more ordinary people, the approach was usually simpler. Some women track their cycles with a moon phase calendar etched into a wooden disc or marked on the back of a church calendar. A midwife might help chart safe days, advising the woman to avoid intimacy during the 3 days before and after the full moon, especially if she'd had a vivid dream or seen certain birds that morning. Yes, omens were part of the whole thing. A raven at sunrise meant fertility, a dove meant safety, a bat? Probably just bad news. Then of course there were prayers. Holy abstinence, it was sometimes called, praying for the strength to resist temptation on high-risk nights. Some women reportedly invoked saints known for virginity or modesty, St. Agnes, St. Cecilia, and occasionally Mary herself. Others combined their prayers with more direct methods, such as placing a blessed stone under the bed, or tying a red thread around their wrist during the moon's dark phase to close the womb's eye. That phrase comes up more often than you'd expect in medieval fertility texts. No one knew what it meant exactly, but everyone agreed it sounded serious. Now for the fringe angle, in some particularly creative pockets of folk astrology, it was believed that if a woman conceived while Mercury was retrograde, the child would never be born, because the soul would get lost on its way to the flesh. That sounds tragic, but in practice, it led some couples to intentionally choose Mercury retrograde as their contraception strategy. Not the most ethical plan, but it gives you an idea of how astrology could be weaponized when no better options were on the table. Naturally, these practices weren't foolproof. Plenty of people still conceived despite avoiding all the dangerous phases, but the belief in cosmic contraception endured for centuries. Why? Because it offered something tangible in a world where biology was mysterious and choices were limited. It gave people structure, language, and, crucially, hope. Hope that they could enjoy love without consequence. Hope that the heavens would understand the difference between desire and disaster. And here's the scholarly debate. Were people using these methods seriously, or were they just a poetic way to frame luck and chance? Some historians argue that celestial contraception was mostly symbolic, a way of adding order to the chaos of unpredictable fertility. Others point out that these methods were passed down, refined, and practiced across regions for hundreds of years, meaning they were treated not as ritual, but as real strategy. In truth, it was probably both. A little science, a little magic, and a whole lot of desperation. So tonight, think about all the nights that weren't. All the moments when people sat quietly beside the fire, checked the stars and said, "Not now." Sometimes they were wrong, sometimes it worked. But either way, They looked up at the moon and tried to wrestle a little control from a universe that rarely gave it freely. And really, what could be more human than that? The candlelight flickers low in a chamber that smells faintly of ink, rosemary and wax. You're seated in front of a man who looks like he hasn't smiled since the last plague wave ended. His robes are dark, his fingers stained with ink, and his eyes are fixed on a rotating brass sphere he cradles like it's a newborn chick. You've come to him with good news, or so you thought. A child is on the way. But when he sees the date of conception, his brows crease into a canyon of concern. Mars was retrograde. Mercury was in the 8th house. Venus had been eclipsed by the moon. He sighs and murmurs, "Ah, a child of regret." Welcome to one of the more ominous chapters in medieval astrology. The belief that planetary retrogrades, those odd periods when a planet appears to move backward in the sky, weren't just curious astronomical illusions. They were cosmic warnings, times of backwardness, mistakes, misalignment. And if you happen to conceive a child during one of these periods, well, don't say the stars didn't warn you. Mars in retrograde, aggression turned inward. Children born from such conceptions were said to be quick to anger but unable to act on it. What one 14th century astrologer poetically described as a roaring fire beneath glass. They might seethe with emotion but struggle with direction. Mercury retrograde was no better. These children were believed to be slow of tongue, confused in purpose, or prone to lies, not because they were evil, but because the star that governed speech and clarity had been moving the wrong way when their soul was fastened to flesh. And then there was Venus. Oh dear, retrograde Venus. This one was especially feared in matters of love and fertility. A child conceived during her backwards motion was thought to be unlucky in affection, prone to heartbreak, or, more damning in the eyes of the church, excessively sensual. Some texts even claimed that children born of Venus retrograde grew into those who love too many and too well, which sounds charming now, but back then it was practically a moral death sentence. Retrogrades weren't rare. Each major planet had its turn and their backward dances could last weeks or months. That meant plenty of chances for astrologers to advise couples to wait, to pause, to abstain until the planets straightened themselves out. And for those who couldn't or wouldn't resist the urge, well, that's where the guilt began. Let's talk about the 8th house for a moment. In medieval astrology, this house was associated with death, decay, and things hidden below the surface. If Mercury happened to be retrograde and sitting in the 8th house at the time of conception, the child was said to be born with secrets buried deep, possibly a liar, possibly a thief, or just unlucky. Some of these interpretations were disturbingly specific. One physician's manual from the late 1300s lists traits like teeth that rot too soon, dreams that cause waking tears, and a voice like echo through water. Vague? Yes. Creepy? Absolutely. Historical fun fact. During a planetary retrograde in 1374, the English astrologer John of Eschenden warned noble families to avoid all intimate unions for the span of 40 days. He even wrote a public letter claiming that the air is now infected with false light. He meant this metaphorically, but people took him literally. There were rumours that babies conceived during that period had wandering eyes, could not sleep through the night, or had mismatched limbs. Most of it was folklore fueled by anxiety, but that didn't stop the rumours from spreading. On the fringe end of things, some astrologers believed that retrograde planets didn't just affect personality, they warped time itself. One obscure tract from Prague claimed that children conceived during triple retrogrades, when Mercury, Mars and Saturn all appeared to move backward, would be touched by the past, born with memories of previous lives or dreams that foretold the future. Naturally, most such children were just odd, quiet, prone to staring at walls, but that was enough to get the neighbours whispering. And of course, the question lingered. Could you undo a retrograde birth? Not easily. Some midwives believed that washing the newborn in moon-blessed water on the 3rd night after birth could wash away the backstep of the stars. Others said that reciting a blessing in reverse, yes, backward, could align the soul with the proper course. There's little evidence these rituals ever worked, but they weren't performed in jest. They were done with trembling hands and whispered Latin. Because no one wanted their child to grow up twisted by celestial regret. Not all retrograde beliefs were dark. Jupiter's retrograde, while considered unlucky for wealth and expansion, was thought to create introspective children, wise beyond their years, bookish, monk-like. Saturn retrograde was feared by most, but some saw it as a marker of deep insight and spiritual potential, if the child could survive its early years. That was a big if. So what does the scholarship say? Was all this just a way to explain bad luck after the fact? A child born with a limp or a squint? Just blame a retrograde. Convenient. Historians remain divided. Some argue that the retrograde doctrine was rooted in observational astronomy, a poetic attempt to describe celestial patterns using human language. Others believe it was a moral framework. Retrograde births were used to warn against lust, impatience, or unblessed unions. Either way, these ideas had real impact. They shaped marriages, medical advice, and even inheritance decisions. Because here's the brutal truth. Some noble families used astrology as a reason to pass over children. A boy born under Mercury retrograde might be judged unfit to inherit. His confused stars a convenient excuse. A daughter born under Venus retrograde, shipped to a convent. Whether the stars actually shaped these destinies is beside the point. People believed they did, and belief in the Middle Ages was often stronger than fact. So tonight, if you hear that Mercury is retrograde and someone groans about broken emails and spilled coffee, just remember, a few hundred years ago, they would have feared giving birth to a doomed prophet with mismatched ears. The world turns, the stars spin, and even when they seem to go backward, we keep moving forward, haunted by what might have been written in that slow, glowing ink of the sky. It's Sunday morning, and the cathedral bells echo across the fields, cutting through the mist like a divine reminder. Inside the stone walls of the church, incense curls upward, while robed figures chant in Latin, their voices heavy with reverence. Somewhere beyond the altar, a woman kneels, her belly rounded beneath layers of wool and linen, her eyes shut tight. She's praying, not just for a safe birth, but for forgiveness. Last night, in the quiet of her chamber, she consulted the stars, and that, according to doctrine, might have been a sin. This was the uneasy line medieval people walked every day, the tension between church and stars. On the one hand, astrology offered hope, logic, and a sense of control in a chaotic world. On the other, it nudged dangerously close to heresy, especially when it claimed to predict, or worse, influence, human destiny. The Church's relationship with astrology was less a hard no and more a suspicious side-eye. Some popes condemned it outright. Others employed astrologers in secret. It was like having a powerful cousin no one wanted to acknowledge at the dinner table. The root of the conflict was theological. Christianity taught that God created the heavens and ruled over all things, including conception, birth, and death. To suggest that planets and stars could determine your fate was, in effect, to say that free will was an illusion. If your child was born under a cursed alignment, if Venus retrograde made you lustful, if Saturn in the 5th house meant you'd never bear children, what room did that leave for sin or salvation? For repentance? For prayer? But astrology had been folded into medicine, and medicine was allowed, barely, within church parameters. So the stars crept in through the back door disguised as diagnosis. It is not that the stars force you, one astrologer wrote defensively, but that they incline you. That little word, incline, became a theological loophole big enough to drive a cart through. The stars don't control you. They simply suggest. You can choose otherwise, if your will is strong enough. Still, there were boundaries. Predicting the future? Dangerous. Claiming the stars could override divine intervention? Borderline blasphemy. Using astrology for sorcery or to summon spirits? Straight to the Inquisitor's bench. But if you were simply checking a natal chart to see whether Jupiter might ease your labour pains, that was just being thorough. And if a midwife quietly adjusted her delivery timing to avoid a Mars hour? Well, she didn't exactly say why. Some of the most damning critiques came from religious scholars. St. Augustine, way back in the 5th century, famously warned against astrology, arguing that it enslaved the soul to fate and robbed people of moral responsibility. He also pointed out, rather cleverly, that twins born under the same sky often lived very different lives, so how could their stars be the same? This became one of the church's favourite anti-astrology arguments. If stars controlled destiny, why did twins often meet opposite fates? But astrology had powerful defenders too. Thomas Aquinas, yes, that Aquinas, acknowledged that celestial bodies could affect the physical world, just as the moon controlled the tides. He didn't deny astrology's influence outright, he simply cautioned against attributing too much to it. Others went further, arguing that God designed the stars as part of his plan. In that view, astrology wasn't opposition, it was interpretation. Reading the stars was reading the divine text of creation. Still, the danger was real. There were trials. A few astrologer physicians were accused of sorcery or heresy, especially if they got a prediction too right or too wrong. One poor soul in 1357 claimed a noblewoman would have twins and was jailed when she gave birth to only one. Another, more dramatically, predicted a miscarriage under a blood moon and was later found drowned in a well. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world that feared both witchcraft and bad weather, nothing was off limits for suspicion. And yet, women kept consulting the stars, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. Wealthy noblewomen paid astrologers to elect conception dates or birth moments. Peasant women tracked moon phases etched into the undersides of pots. Some wore saint medals and Zodiac talismans, covering all their bases. They prayed to Mary in the morning and read the lunar chart before bed. This wasn't rebellion, it was realism. In a world where childbirth could kill you and your baby before sunrise, you took whatever help you could get. Historical fact break: in the 14th century, the Bishop of Norwich banned all starcraft from being practiced within monasteries, claiming it drew men from prayer and set their minds on profane things. Less than a year later, his own physician was caught carrying an astrological almanac tucked inside a book of hours. When questioned, he said, "The stars are merely God's clock. I am but the watchman." Fringe alert. There's a legend from Bohemia about a group of midwives who practiced a secret angelic astrology, claiming that certain constellations carried messages not from the planets, but from archangels. They believed each soul was escorted into the womb by a celestial guide, and the position of the stars marked which angel had done the delivery. If you were born under Orion, you were a warrior. Under Lyra, a poet. Under Andromeda, well, best not to ask. So where do scholars stand? Some argue that astrology was always a threat to orthodoxy, never fully accepted, always treading the line between tool and temptation. Others say the church's disapproval was more about control than theology. Astrology gave people answers the clergy couldn't provide. It offered patterns, predictions, some agency in a world where God's will often felt arbitrary and harsh. Better to ask Venus what kind of child you'd bear than to wonder why God gave you a dead one. And tonight, that's the haunting truth. For all its superstition and complexity, astrology gave comfort. It explained, it warned, it softened the blow. The church offered salvation after death. Astrology tried to make sense of life before it. So as the bells fade and the stars blink into view, remember the women who prayed and charted both, who crossed themselves while noting Mercury's position, who lit candles for saints and for Saturn, who refused to choose between the divine and the celestial, and found, in the quiet between prayers, a rhythm all their own. It's a cool night in a countryside village, and someone's giving birth. Again. You're standing outside a small cottage with smoke curling lazily from the chimney, the low groan of labour rising and falling like a chant. Inside, the midwife kneels beside the bed, one hand gripping the labouring woman's arm, the other quietly adjusting the worn leather strap wrapped around her own wrist. Etched faintly into the strap is a planetary glyph, one you wouldn't recognise unless you knew what to look for. A symbol of the moon, maybe Venus. She hasn't told anyone she watches the stars. She doesn't need to. She just knows. And tonight the stars say this baby should arrive before dawn, or not at all. Welcome to the double life of the medieval midwife, healer, caretaker, spiritual guide, and sometimes secret astrologer. While university-trained physicians debated celestial influence from their lofty towers and cloistered halls, midwives were down in the dirt and blood, watching what actually happened. And what they saw over and over was that births didn't come at random. They came with the moon, with certain breezes, with the chill before storms, and for some midwives, Those patterns meant only one thing. The stars were involved, whether the church liked it or not. Officially, most midwives were trained in practical, hands-on knowledge passed from woman to woman. They knew when a labour was progressing normally and when to prepare for loss. They could identify fevers, breech births, retained placentas, all without ever reading a book. But some went further. Some studied almanacs. Some learned from apothecaries or friars who kept dusty old astrology manuals in the back of their shops. Others couldn't even read but had memorised enough to track the lunar phases or recognise a waning crescent when it slid across the night sky. They didn't draw full natal charts. That was for city astrologers with ink-stained fingers and ivory compasses. What midwives practiced was more intuitive, more immediate. They watched the moon. They noted planetary hours. They whispered the names of saints or planets, sometimes both, in the heat of labour. Not because they were witches, but because they were paying attention. Some deliveries, they swore, were smoother under certain moons. The full moon, in particular, was notorious for starting labours, especially chaotic ones. Midwives called them moon births. You'd suddenly have 2-3 women in labour in the same night, babies arriving like floodwater. One French midwife in the early 1400s kept a journal where she wrote, "The moon calls them out. She says, 'Now is the time,' and they listen." She never published her notes, but she delivered over 200 babies, and people listened to her. Planetary hours were another tool. Each day was divided into sections, each ruled by a different planet. Venus's hour, they believed, was favourable for gentler labours, Jupiter's for strength, but Mars, dangerous, Saturn, too slow. If a birth began under one of these, some midwives would quietly try to stall things, offering calming herbs, cold cloths, whispered reassurances, not just for the mother's comfort, but to try to get through to a better hour, if they could. Because sometimes the baby had its own plan. Some midwives even chose to schedule labour if they had the luxury. This was rare and only possible for wealthier women, but if you could induce birth with herbs or other means, the midwife might suggest waiting for a more favourable hour. It wasn't exactly surgery, it was more like steering a river, and not all clients knew the reasons behind the delay. "You're not ready yet," the midwife might say, or "let's wait until the sun is a little lower." She wasn't lying, she just wasn't telling the whole story. Naturally, this put midwives in a dangerous position. The church didn't approve of astrology, especially when practiced by women. And midwives were already under suspicion for their intimate knowledge of life and death. Add a few moon charts to the mix, and suddenly you had a reputation. Some women were accused of witchcraft, others were shunned. But many walked the line carefully, hiding their knowledge in everyday phrases. "The moon is bright tonight, good sign." Or, "I think the little one wants to wait for sunrise." Nobody questioned that. Nobody needed to. Historical fact time. A 15th century case in Flanders records the confession of a midwife who admitted under interrogation that she'd timed births to avoid the hour of Mars. She said she'd seen too many babies born during that hour die within the week. She didn't claim it was magic. She called it care. She was fined and released, likely because too many women in the village vouched for her skill. And now for the fringe. There's an odd, half-burned page found in a monastery archive in Austria that describes a midwife who claimed to hear planetary voices during births. She said Venus sang, Mars grunted, Saturn wept. She wasn't executed, but her name was scratched out of parish records, erased, as though she'd never caught a single child. There's ongoing scholarly debate about whether these star-watching midwives were common or rare. Some argue that most women didn't need astrology, they had observation and experience. Others point to the consistency of lunar references across oral traditions, moon births, Venus hours, labour herbs picked under Jupiter. These aren't random. They show up in different places, spoken in different tongues. That doesn't happen by accident, and really it doesn't matter whether every midwife tracked planetary positions or just a handful did. What matters is that, even in a world where women were expected to be silent, a few quietly took the stars into their hands and used them to guide life into the world. They weren't trying to challenge the church or rewrite the heavens, they were just trying to help, to protect, to understand why some babies came fast and others struggled, why some lived and some slipped away before the first breath. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, imagine that quiet cottage once more, the fire burning low, the labouring cries rising like prayer, and a midwife with her hand on a wrist strap counting the minutes until the hour of Venus. She says nothing, but her eyes flick toward the moon. And for a moment, you wonder, who's really delivering this child? The woman beside the bed, or something far above it? The tavern's noisy tonight. Spilled ale, dice clattering on wood, voices weaving in and out of bawdy songs about saints and sin. But tucked in the farthest corner, near a broken window that leaks smoke and moonlight, sits a woman with a scrap of parchment and a look that says she's not here for the mead. She's reading someone's star chart, not a noble's, not a bishop's, a sex worker's. Because even in the least blessed corners of medieval society, the stars still mattered, perhaps even more so. And among harlots, hustlers, and the women who patched them up, horoscopes were tools of survival. Astrology wasn't just for royal babies and duchesses trying to pick the perfect hour to conceive. It extended all the way down the social ladder to women whose names were never written in illuminated manuscripts, but who lived and died according to the same sky. And in many cases they were even more tuned into it. If you worked in sex, astrology wasn't entertainment. It was occupational advice, psychological shield, and maybe, if you were lucky, a bit of protection against the chaos that came with your trade. Let's start with the belief that certain star signs produced natural lovers. Medieval texts describe women born under specific signs as being more inclined towards sensuality, especially Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Pisces. One handbook aimed at travelling merchants includes a section on how to know the nature of a woman by her sign, warning that Scorpios were dangerously seductive and that Pisceans may seem innocent but burn hot under moonlight. It's half astrology, half gossip, but it reflects a widespread belief. Your sign said something about your libido and your virtue. This idea filtered into the work lives of sex workers. In brothels from Paris to Prague, madams were known to keep informal charts of their girls' birth signs. Why? Because it helped with matchmaking. If a nobleman came in asking for someone born under Venus, she knew exactly who to send. If he wanted a mercurial companion, clever, talkative, discreet, same thing. It wasn't so different from modern dating apps, except you were paying by the hour and hoping no one from the bishop's office dropped by. There are scattered records of midwives who worked closely with sex workers, not only providing basic medical care but offering astrological advice. If a woman wanted to avoid conception, and many did, they'd consult lunar charts, track barren zodiac signs, or use saturnine amulets wrapped around the thigh. These weren't foolproof. But they were better than nothing, and sometimes they were all that stood between you and a future you couldn't afford. Some madams took it further. There's mention in a 14th century Venetian court document of a brothel that used astrology to assign shifts, believing that women ruled by certain planets had more energy or charm during specific hours. One woman, reportedly born under Leo, refused to work during the waning moon, claiming it made her feel dimmed and dull. Her madam agreed. Why argue with a woman who brings in 5 times the coin when Jupiter's in her favour? It wasn't all business, though. For many of these women, astrology was also deeply personal. It gave them a narrative, a reason for why their lives unfolded the way they did. Born under Mars, one might say, shrugging after a fight. Or, I should have never trusted a Gemini. It wasn't just personality typing, it was emotional armour, a way to make sense of a world that rarely offered kindness or control. And this wasn't isolated. There's evidence that some city almanacs, sold cheaply on street corners, included sections aimed specifically at women working in public houses. These pages often contained fertility calendars, lists of lucky and unlucky days for love, and short blurbs like, "Beware lovers with Saturn rising in Scorpio, they bring sorrow and slow payment." Think medieval horoscopes crossed with survival guides. Historical fact. In London, a woman known only as Marjorie of the Moon was said to offer both midwifery and astrological services to brothel workers. She claimed she could seal the womb with a prayer and a pinch of salt if you visited her during Mercury's hour. City officials turned a blind eye, likely because half of them were her clients. She shows up in at least 2 civic complaints, but no charges were ever filed. Fringe detail of the night. In a little-known German text from the late 1400s, there's a ritual described for securing affection from a man of wealth. It involves drawing a circle on the ground with water infused with Venus-ruled herbs, like yarrow and violet, at the hour Venus trines the moon. The woman is to stand in the circle and recite the man's name backwards, while burning a piece of cloth he once wore. It ends with a warning. If the moon is in Aries, the spell shall backfire. That detail alone is peak medieval astrological chaos. Naturally, the church was not thrilled about any of this. Astrology was suspicious enough when used by scholars. In the hands of women, especially women of unworthy professions, it became doubly dangerous. Midwives were monitored, fortune-tellers were accused of witchcraft, and women who talked too openly about the stars were often silenced, sometimes permanently. But the practice endured, especially in cities, because, as one chronicler put it, where bread is earned in darkness, the stars are always watching. So what do historians make of it all? Some argue that astrology among sex workers was more performative than real, just part of the theatrical language of seduction. Others see it as grassroots science, a way for marginalised women to create structure, manage risk, and make choices in a world that gave them very few. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Astrology was flexible. It could be a weapon, a balm, a flirtation, or a prayer. So tonight, imagine that crowded brothel back room, the laughter, the perfume, the clink of coins, and the scratch of quill on parchment. A woman checking a crude chart by candlelight, muttering, "No, not tonight. The moon's in Taurus and my back hurts." She's not just stalling, she's choosing. She's watching the stars and listening to her body, and for a moment, just a flicker, she's in control. There's a quiet courtyard just past the chapel gardens, hidden behind a high wall and heavy gate. If you visit it just after Vespers, when the sky starts melting into violet and the cloister falls silent, you'll find her there, bent over a small wooden table, brushing dust from the corner of a yellowing scroll. She's a nun, a scribe, a healer, and unknown to her abbess, a student of the stars. Because even within convent walls, under vows of chastity and obedience, there were women mapping the heavens, looking for divine order, yes, but also for deeper truths. The kind the church didn't always approve of. This is the hidden world of cloistered astrologers, nuns and religious women who, while outwardly devoted to prayer and obedience, quietly cultivated their own relationships with the stars, and not just for poetic contemplation. Many of them used astrology to understand health, fertility, and the female body, knowledge that wasn't supposed to matter to them, but which they recorded anyway, tucked into margins and codes, hiding diagrams behind psalms. It's easy to forget that medieval convents weren't just centres of faith. They were also schools, hospitals, and archives. Women there copied texts, tended gardens, distilled medicine, and tracked the rhythms of the world. Some were highly educated, fluent in Latin, trained in natural philosophy, and deeply familiar with the cycles of the moon, the properties of herbs, and yes, the patterns of the stars. And while not all of them practiced astrology, enough did that we have scraps of evidence, lunar calendars annotated in nunneries, fertility charts bound inside books of hours, even bits of planetary symbolism embroidered into altar cloths. They didn't draw up full natal charts like court astrologers, but they paid attention to conjunctions, eclipses, and lunar transits. Not to predict the future, but to understand the present, to track when nuns fell ill, to record how the lunar cycle affected the mood of the infirmary, to note quietly how the moon and Mars seemed always to precede bloody stools or sudden fevers. The data was spiritual and scientific, and it often came in the form of beautifully written observations. Sister Agnes weeps more on the full moon. Sister Judith burns with fever 3 days after its peak. Some of these women were also midwives, or had been before taking vows. They still tended to women in childbirth, especially in abbeys that offered sanctuary to travellers or orphans. There are records of nunneries where birth was a regular occurrence, and the nuns assisted discreetly, maintaining silence about the women's identities, and if you think they didn't consult the heavens before cutting an umbilical cord, think again. A lunar chart might be pinned discreetly to the inside of a cabinet. A strip of blessed linen, stitched during Venus's hour, might be wrapped around the mother's wrist for strength and gentleness. One of the more fascinating examples comes from a Benedictine nunnery in what's now Belgium. There, scribes compiled a book known as the Liber Luminis, the Book of Light. It's not an astrological manual, at least not overtly. It's a collection of hymns, prayers, and healing recipes. But woven throughout are quiet nods to celestial influence, references to planetary hours, seasonal cycles, and the occasional zodiac glyph slipped between verses. Scholars now believe the nuns were using it as a hybrid devotional and medical text, coding astrological knowledge into a safer spiritual framework. Here's a historical gem. The 12th century polymath Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, mystic and composer, wrote extensively about the influence of the moon and stars on the human body. While she never positioned herself as an astrologer, her writings on the natural rhythms of fertility, illness and mood make it clear she paid attention to the heavens. She described the moon as a regulator of the waters within and linked celestial movement to both spiritual and physical states. In her own mystical way, Hildegard was reading the same sky the court astrologers were, just in a different key. On the fringe end of things, there's a surviving letter from an unknown abbess, likely early 14th century, who wrote to a fellow nun about a dream she had beneath the tail of the Great Bear. She claimed she saw a child born with wings, conceived under Mercury and loosed in the hour of Mars. She interpreted it as a vision of future war. But modern scholars speculate that it might have reflected her own private work with astrological symbolism, recast as dreams so it wouldn't draw ecclesiastical suspicion. Of course, the Church officially discouraged this kind of practice. Astrology was tolerated among clerics and scholars, barely, but for women, especially cloistered ones, it was seen as inappropriate at best, heretical at worst. A nun meddling in the stars risked being accused of vanity, overreaching, or witchcraft. So most worked in secret. The stars weren't just in the sky. They were hidden between lines, stitched into hems, traced in the dirt with a careful fingertip before being brushed away. And yet, they endured. Quiet observers, intellectuals with quills and candles peering out the window at the night sky, and wondering what pattern might connect a woman's fever to the bright face of Jupiter. They weren't claiming to defy God. They were trying to understand his rhythms, to read the clock he'd set spinning above them. And sometimes they did. There's scholarly debate about how widespread this was. Some argue it was limited to a few isolated convents, barely a ripple. Others suggest we're just missing the evidence, that more texts existed, but were destroyed or disguised to avoid persecution. Given how little female scholarship survives in clear, credited form from the Middle Ages, it's hard to say. But the hints we do have, coded calendars, annotated prayers, herbal guides with lunar symbols, suggest that these women were watching closely, even if no one was watching them. So tonight, think of that quiet courtyard again. A woman bent over parchment, her fingers smudged with ink and starlight. She isn't seeking power, she isn't casting spells, she's simply listening. To the moon, to the wind, to the rhythm of a world she was told to obey, but which she couldn't help but question. And maybe, just maybe, the stars whispered back. The road is muddy, the sky the colour of wet stone, and ahead of you, a hunched figure in a cloak clutches a satchel filled with powders, parchments, and small glass bottles that clink with each step. This is the kind of traveller most villagers recognise before they even knock. Part healer, part mystic, part gossip magnet. She's what they call a cunning woman, and tonight she's come not for a wound or a cough, but to offer her insight on a marriage that has, in the words of the anxious wife, borne only silence and empty cradles. The woman of the house wants a baby. The cunning woman wants to see the stars first. This is where astrology met fertility rituals in the most rustic, intimate sense. Far from the university halls and cathedral archives, in muddy villages and roadside cottages, ordinary women carried on traditions that mixed herbalism, superstition, and skywatching into something uniquely their own. These weren't proper astrologers. They weren't writing almanacs or calculating lunar declinations, but they were paying attention, and what they did with that attention shaped the intimate hopes of entire communities. The first thing a cunning woman might do is check the moon. Not in a chart, but with her own eyes. Was it waxing? Full? Hidden? Certain faces favoured conception, especially the waxing moon, which symbolised growth, increase and promise. A waning moon was less favourable, seen as a time of shrinking, letting go. She might also ask the woman her birth sign, not because she was about to draw a detailed natal chart, but because the Zodiac was believed to rule different parts of the body. Cancer ruled the breasts and womb, Virgo the intestines and female health. If the woman was born under a fertile sign, like Taurus or Pisces, that was seen as a hopeful indicator. Barren signs, like Leo or Aquarius, however, might require additional help, usually in the form of charms or timing rituals. Timing was everything. Some cunning women used what they called seed days, loosely based on planetary hours and the movement of the moon. You might be told to lie with your husband when the moon was in Cancer or Scorpio, but never when it was in Aries or Gemini. If you plant in dry ground, one old woman was said to warn, don't expect green things to grow. And if you wanted a boy, wait for a full moon in Sagittarius or Leo. A girl, try the crescent phase in Libra or Pisces. None of this was official doctrine, but it was lived wisdom. Herbs naturally played a role, but they weren't chosen solely for their physical effects. Their astrological correspondences mattered too. Mugwort, ruled by Venus and the moon, was used to open the womb. Nettle, ruled by Mars, was said to bring strength. Rue, associated with Saturn, could delay fertility or cool the blood. These plants weren't just medicinal, they were seen as planetary tools. Gathered on the right day, under the right moon, they became part of a ritual aimed at bending the odds, if only slightly, in the hopeful woman's favour. And then came the fringe elements, the weird, the whispered, the things you didn't write down unless you wanted a visit from the local priest. One fertility ritual involved tying a cloth soaked in wine and myrtle around a woman's thighs while chanting a verse that invoked both Venus and Mary. Another required sleeping with a stone said to have fallen from a star, believed to carry the spark of life. One particularly strange account from Wales details a ritual where the woman had to walk backward 3 times around her marital bed during the hour of Jupiter, then burn the bedding straw at dawn while naming the desired child aloud. Sometimes the cunning woman would perform a sort of chartless divination, reading smoke, fire, or even animal behaviour to predict conception chances. If a hen laid 2 eggs in one day, or if a dog howled during the Venus hour, that was considered a sign of success. If an owl was spotted on the roof, try again next month. It sounds absurd now, but in a world without thermometers, ovulation strips or ultrasound scans, people grasped at what they had. Patterns, rhythms, the stubborn hope that nature, when listened to properly, might give you what you longed for. Historical fact. There's a surviving recipe from a 14th century herbal manuscript, attributed to a cunning woman near York, that lists a potion to quicken barren women. It includes fennel, for digestion, rose petals, for the heart, and powdered pearl, for Venus's favour, all steeped in red wine and consumed during the moon's first quarter. A side note in the margin reads, best taken when Venus smiles and no storm has passed for 3 days. That's astrology, weather magic, and folk medicine all in one goblet. As for the scholarly debate, it's a tangled one. Some argue that these women were simply using astrology as theatre, adding cosmic flair to make their services feel more potent. Others contend that their knowledge, though informal, was part of a larger decentralised tradition of skywatching passed through oral culture. It's likely both are true. These women weren't academic astrologers, but they weren't charlatans either. They knew how to read the world, even if their methods were stitched together from scraps and stars. Church authorities predictably distrusted them, not just because of the astrology, but because of the autonomy. A woman practicing medicine and offering hope outside ecclesiastical control, that was dangerous. Some were accused of witchcraft, others were simply discredited. But many kept going anyway, because women kept coming to them, for advice, for healing, for the chance, however slim, to bring life into a life that had so little control. So tonight, picture that small cottage, the fire snapping low, the cunning woman carefully wrapping a bundle of herbs in cloth, whispering, "Wait until the moon has turned." She's not promising a miracle. She's offering a chance wrapped in ritual lit by starlight. And if it doesn't work this month, well, the moon will wax again. It always does. The child is screaming again. It's the kind of high, piercing wail that makes animals shift nervously in their stalls and grown men step outside just to escape the sound. The midwife has already said there's no illness. The priest came and muttered his prayers, but nothing helps. The mother, pale from sleepless nights, clutches a bundle of linens and fear. She turns to the old woman who's just entered the room, the one who doesn't wear a cross but carries a bone-handled knife and something strange stitched into her hem. A star. 5 points. Barely visible. She doesn't need to ask what's wrong, she already knows. She checks the child's birth hour and frowns. The moon was in Scorpio, and Mars was rising. "Poor soul," she says quietly. "You were born under a cursed sky." Welcome to the unnerving world of medieval postnatal astrology, where birth charts weren't just used to predict personality or future wealth, but to explain, and sometimes judge, the baby's very existence. In a society with little understanding of genetics, neurology, or mental health, astrology filled in the gaps. If a child cried too much, didn't feed properly, failed to walk or speak at the expected time, people didn't blame DNA, they blamed the stars. The idea was that the moment of birth, the first breath, captured a cosmic fingerprint. Whatever configuration the heavens held at that second imprinted itself on the newborn soul, shaping everything from their temperament to their future misfortunes. A child born under a Mercury-Saturn conjunction might be slow to speak or plagued with sadness. Born during a lunar eclipse, prone to melancholy or cursed with wandering thoughts. The stars didn't just suggest traits. They were used to explain any abnormality, whether physical, mental or behavioural. This meant that midwives, astrologers, and even parents sometimes rushed to record the exact moment of birth. Not just the day, but the hour, the minute, the phase of the moon. It wasn't idle curiosity, it was seen as preventative medicine. With that data, an astrologer could cast a proper nativity chart and offer warnings. Avoid fire, watch for head injuries, keep the child from high places, don't let them fast on Wednesdays. Some of the warnings were practical, others were strange. A Mars-ruled child, for instance, might be told never to drink water drawn from a well on a Tuesday. Why? No one really knew, but they did it anyway. Sometimes these charts were used to determine not just care, but worth. A baby born with a strong chart, Sun in Leo, Moon in Taurus, Jupiter rising, was believed to be lucky, destined for success or leadership. But one born with afflicted aspects or too many planets in cold houses might be quietly set aside. Not physically abandoned, though that happened too, but emotionally distanced. She has a hard road, someone might murmur, watching a colicky baby thrash in the cradle. A child of Saturn. And for children who didn't survive infancy, astrology offered an explanation that, for grieving parents, was sometimes easier to accept than random tragedy. His stars were never favourable, the mother might say, tears soaking her sleeve. He wasn't meant for this world. It sounds harsh, but in a way, it was comforting. It turned arbitrary loss into something cosmic, something fated, something you couldn't control, so you didn't have to blame yourself. Historical record, a late 13th century astrologer in Bologna was summoned to explain why a noble child had been mute since birth. After casting a chart, he claimed the boy had been born during the moon's fall in Scorpio with Mercury square Saturn. He concluded the child would never speak, but would dream with great vividness. The family was reportedly satisfied with this explanation, and stopped seeking cures. Instead, they trained the boy to draw and considered him touched by divine melancholy. He became a minor painter, and his work appears unsigned in 2 chapels. On the darker edge of things, there were moments when astrology was used to justify cruelty. Children born with deformities or disabilities were sometimes labelled starstruck, believed to be under malevolent planetary influence. Some communities whispered that such children had been conceived or born during eclipses, retrogrades, or even planetary battles. One grim account from a small German village tells of a child born with fused fingers and a cleft palate during a conjunction of Mars and Saturn. The parents were advised by a local priest, not an astrologer, to see it as punishment for consulting the stars during Lent. The irony was bitter. But there was also compassion. Some midwives used astrology to advocate for children who might otherwise be dismissed. A sickly baby might be explained as having been born under Mars, but that could be seen as a call to protect them fiercely, not abandon them. One French midwife's notes describe a boy with the soul of iron but the bones of wax, likely a child with a bone condition, whose chart showed Mars and Moon in opposition. She insisted the family swaddle him with rosemary and sleep beside him during Mars hours. He reportedly lived into his teens, unusual for his condition. Now for the Fringe, there's a marginal note in an English herbal where someone, likely a midwife or cunning woman, sketched a rough natal chart with the words eyes on Tuesday, hands in April, belly in moonlight. Scholars aren't sure what it means. It may have been part of a charm or a care guide for a child born with a specific affliction. Some believe it maps the timing of specific symptoms or treatments. Others think it might refer to planetary correspondences, body parts ruled by signs and planets. Either way, it shows just how intimately birth and astrology were intertwined. The scholarly debate is thorny. Was postnatal astrology a coping mechanism for loss and disability, or a dangerous form of predestination that limited how people treated children? Some argue it gave people a way to process trauma. Others say it contributed to fatalism, reinforcing the idea that certain children weren't meant to thrive. There's truth in both. Astrology, like any belief system, can comfort and constrain at once. But what's clear is this. In the medieval mind, a child wasn't born into a vacuum. They arrived already inscribed, with stars, with omens, with silent music only the heavens could hear, and those who attended the birth listened for it, trying to interpret what it meant, how best to respond, and whether they were holding a future saint, a misfit, or someone who might never survive the winter. So tonight, as you remember that shrieking newborn and the woman whispering under her breath about Mars, think about how many generations looked upward to make sense of what had just arrived in their arms. A soul in flesh, a breath under Saturn, a future scribbled in constellations no one could fully read. But still, they tried. The festival fire is dying down, and the sky above you is a riot of stars, far more than you'd ever see from a city. It's late, and the drunken singing has faded into low murmurs and laughter from shadowy corners. But at the edge of the meadow, just past the apple carts and woven garlands, a girl kneels in the grass with her hands clasped in prayer. Not to God, not exactly. She's whispering to Venus, or maybe to the moon. She was told tonight is special. A gate night. One of the few in the year when the heavens open just enough to let something extra in. A child conceived tonight, they say, will carry a star in their heart. These were the nights where medieval astrology left the world of daily charts and herbal guides and entered something far older and stranger. Ritual astrology. Not about diagnosis or timing, about myth, about cosmic mystery. A belief that certain alignments didn't just affect you, they transformed the world around you. And when those moments lined up with acts of love or fertility, the result wasn't just a child. It was something more, something enchanted, or cursed, or sacred. Medieval Europe had no shortage of stories about magical conceptions tied to the stars. Some came from folklore. Children born under blood moons destined for strange gifts. Twins conceived during eclipses with inverted fates. Babes born at solstice carrying prophecy in their eyes. But these weren't just tales told around the fire. Some were taken seriously, enough to be recorded in court documents, medical notes, and even monastery logs. One recurring motif, the astrological conception, a child born not simply through timing and desire, but because the stars called them forth. Venus trained Jupiter under a waxing moon. That was said to produce a love-born child. Beautiful, charismatic, often artistic, and just a little uncanny. Mars conjunct the moon, a warrior soul, born sharp-edged, likely to suffer, but also to lead. A child born during a planetary cazimi, when a planet sits in the heart of the sun, was considered burned and blessed, forever marked by fire and clarity. The stakes were higher on feast nights and solstices. These were believed to be thin places in time, where the veil between the physical and the divine was at its thinnest. Conceptions that happened during these liminal windows carried powerful astrological signatures and were sometimes called gate births. A child made during the feast of Saint Rowie, John, while the moon passed through the Pleiades, might be fated to speak with animals. One conceived on Candlemas with Venus in Pisces, destined to break hearts, or become a mystic. Naturally, this gave rise to rituals. Couples, often young and hopeful, sometimes desperate, would attempt conception on these nights deliberately, using charms and prayers to invite the right kind of soul. One tradition from Brittany describes bathing together under moonlight, then tying a red ribbon around the woman's belly to catch the fire of Mars. Another from the Low Countries warns couples not to look into each other's eyes at climax if Mercury is retrograde, lest the child be a jester, not a king. Sometimes the rituals got more complex. A manuscript fragment from northern France lists ingredients for a conception charm meant to be burned as the incense during intercourse on a Venus hour. Dried apple blossom, powdered mother of pearl, honey, and a drop of blood from the woman's left thumb. The purpose? To bring forth a girl with words like silver and eyes like dawn. It's hard to tell whether anyone believed these charms truly worked, but that didn't stop people from trying. When the stars align, even skeptics look up. Then there were the dangers. Some planetary alignments were believed to summon not just fertility, but interference, demonic, divine, or otherwise. A child conceived during a lunar eclipse with Saturn in the 8th house might be said to carry hollow luck, doomed to chase what can never be caught. Others feared nights when Mars and the Moon opposed each other, calling them blood nights. Children born from those unions were sometimes viewed with suspicion or pity. Too much fire, not enough grounding. Historical documentation of this is surprisingly rich, even if you have to read between the lines. A birth record from 1391 notes a baby born under the red star at solstice, when no wind blew and Venus was hidden. The child reportedly had mismatched eyes and spoke full sentences before the age of 2, or so the nurse claimed. Another case from Italy records a woman who insisted she'd conceived during a night when Jupiter and Venus danced in the eye of the lion, an apparent reference to a conjunction in Leo. The baby died young, but was said to glow faintly just after birth, and the midwife declared she'd never deliver under Leo again. And then there's the Fringe, a strange tradition from a Carpathian region, where couples would sleep outside during starfall nights, peak meteor showers, believing that each falling star was a soul seeking a womb. They'd lie beneath the open sky and whisper the names of the unborn, hoping one would answer. No charts, no incantations, just hope and stars and silence. It's deeply moving and deeply eerie. What scholars make of all this depends on how generous they're feeling. Some dismiss it as folk nonsense, rooted in desperation and romantic imagination. Others argue that ritual astrology reflects a deeper symbolic literacy, an attempt to inscribe meaning onto life's most chaotic moments. Birth, death, desire, all placed within a cosmic frame, not to escape randomness, but to participate in it. To say, I see the stars, I know what they mean. I want my life, and my child's life, to be in harmony with them. Was it accurate? Did a conjunction of Mars and Venus really produce bold children? Did full moon conceptions yield lovers or lunatics? Probably not. But it gave people something to believe in, something to plan around, something to whisper in the dark when there was nothing else to hold on to. So tonight, imagine that field again, the stars thick overhead. A girl kneeling in grass, her hand resting gently on her belly, just in case. She's made no promises, she's spoken no spells, she just knows, deep in her bones, that something important is happening, something ancient, something written in light. Whether it leads to birth or just a brighter dream doesn't matter. The ritual has already begun, so here we are at the end of it all. The fire has burned down to glowing coals, the stars are soft and patient above you, and whatever breeze is drifting through your window tonight carries nothing but the quiet hum of the world settling down. You've wandered through medieval streets and abbey halls, ducked into brothels, convents and cottages where women lit candles and murmured prayers under breath not just to saints, but to Saturn, Venus, and the silent pull of the moon. You've watched mothers timing their conception to Mercury's hour, midwives charting labour under waning moons, and astrologers explaining away a child's limp with a misplaced Mars. You've seen nobility plan their heirs with talismans and shepherd girls clutching moon calendars like lifelines. Some thought they were working with divine tools, others thought they were cheating fate, but mostly they were just surviving, hoping, reaching for meaning in a world that didn't often hand it out. It's easy to laugh looking back. Easy to roll your eyes at backward-facing Venus or red thread womb charms, or the idea that being born under a lunar eclipse might make you a poet. But here's the thing. They weren't just guessing. They were paying attention to the sky, to the soil, to the rhythm of things they couldn't name but could still feel in their bones. It wasn't about science, it was about story. And when your body, your fertility, your very survival was as uncertain as the weather, stories were more than just comfort. They were maps. Maybe that's why some of us still check our horoscopes, still ask strangers their signs, still wait for Mercury to go direct before making a big move. Not because we believe the stars control us, but because we like to pretend there's a pattern, that even in the chaos something ancient is still humming behind it all, and maybe, just maybe, if we squint the right way, we can hear what the medieval midwife, the cloistered nun, the cunning woman already knew. The sky is always talking, you just have to listen.